Before there were kings, before written laws, before anyone could leave behind a sentence explaining what happened, people built places that were meant to last longer than a single life. Then, in the dry earth, archaeologists found walls, rooms, and traces of hands that had once shaped a world beneath the desert. The unsettling part is not that the place was found. It is that something made people leave it behind, and the ground kept the silence for thousands of years. They found a 9,000-year-old city beneath the desert, and nobody knows why it was abandoned. Imagine the first touch of a brush against dry earth, moving slowly across a surface that has not seen daylight for thousands of years. At first there is only dust. Then a straight edge appears, too regular to be a stone shaped by accident. A wall begins to show itself. Then another, a floor, a dark patch where fire once burned. The remains are quiet, but they are not empty. They suggest hands, weight, heat, footsteps, meals, sleep, repair and return. Somewhere in that buried place, people once lived close enough to leave their lives pressed into the ground, and far enough from us that almost everything they knew has vanished without words. It is tempting to call such a place a lost city, because from our distance walls beneath the desert feel like the outline of a whole world. But the word must be held carefully. 9,000 years ago, human communities were not cities in the way we usually imagine them now. There were no written street names, no official records, no carved list explaining who founded the settlement or why the last families left. What remains is older, quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. A place where human beings had begun to stay. That small fact changes the meaning of the discovery. For most of our deeper past, the human story was shaped by movement. People followed animals, ripening plants, water, seasons, danger, and opportunity. Home was not always a fixed point on a map. It could be a repeated path, a remembered shelter, a valley known in one season and avoided in another. Then, in some regions after the last ice age, certain groups began to build more lasting places. They did not stop being human in the older sense. Their bodies still belonged to a long inheritance of walking, carrying, watching, gathering, sharing, and adapting. Yet something in the world around them had shifted enough that staying became possible, and perhaps even necessary. In that shift, the earliest roots of settled life began to take shape. A buried settlement beneath dry land is therefore not only an archaeological object, it is a mark left by one of the deepest changes in the human condition. The walls are not just walls. They are evidence that people trusted a place long enough to build into it. They carried material, shaped rooms, remade surfaces, returned to the same ground, and allowed memory to gather in layers. The mystery begins there, because a place that required so much repeated effort was not abandoned lightly. Even if we cannot know the thoughts of the people who lived there, we can understand the weight of what was left behind. A built place holds labour. It holds habits. It holds the pattern of where bodies slept, where fires were lit, where food was prepared, where children may have learned the movements of daily life by watching older hands. When such a place is later found silent beneath sand and dust, the silence is not simple. It is not just the absence of people, it is the absence of the reasons that once made the place worth maintaining. This is why the discovery feels colder than a ruin from a later kingdom. In a palace, a written name might survive. In a city with records, there may be a tax tablet, an inscription, a date, a war, a ruler, a known drought, or at least a human voice preserved in signs. But in a settlement from deep prehistory, before written explanation, the evidence comes without a narrator. The soil may show that people cooked there. The floors may show that they returned again and again. The objects may show skill, routine, and contact with the living landscape. Yet the final decision, or the slow chain of decisions, remains outside direct reach. We are left with traces of presence and the fact of absence. That is why the question should not be rushed. A place can be left for many reasons, and often the most honest answer is not one dramatic event, but a web of changes too slow for any single person to see clearly. The desert may preserve the outline, but it does not preserve the full story. It lets us stand at the edge of early settled life and look down into a human beginning that is still unfinished in our understanding. To understand why a settlement from 9,000 years ago matters, it helps to slow down and look at the world in which it appeared. This was not a world waiting for cities in the modern sense. There were no written maps, no borders drawn by governments, no official calendars marking the beginning of a new age. There were only landscapes, seasons, animals, plants, water, stone, fire, and human bodies learning how to live with changing conditions after the long cold of the Ice Age had loosened its grip. In many regions, the climate was not simply the same dry world we see today. Some places that now feel harsh, open, and desert-like may have held more water, more vegetation, and more animal life in earlier periods. This does not mean every dry landscape was once green in the same way, and it does not mean we can explain every abandoned settlement with one simple climate story, but it reminds us that the earth beneath a ruin may belong to more than one version of the same place. The ground that now seems empty may once have been useful enough for people to return, build, store, bury, cook, and remember. For most of human existence, survival depended on movement through such changing worlds. A group might know where certain plants ripened, where animals passed, where water remained after a dry season, or where stone could be shaped into tools. Knowledge was carried in bodies and memory, not in books. A child did not learn the world by reading a boundary line. A child learned by walking behind others, by noticing tracks, by feeling heat, wind, hunger, thirst, and distance. This older way of life did not vanish suddenly when some people began to settle. The first long-lasting settlements grew out of that deeper inheritance. They were not a clean break from the human past, but a new arrangement built on old skills. People still needed to understand wild plants, animals, weather, and movement. Yet now, in certain places, they also began to put more effort into staying near the same ground. They built walls that could be repaired. They used storage that could hold food beyond a single meal. They returned to hearths, floors, and familiar spaces. Staying created a new kind of human memory, one that could gather in layers of clay, ash, bone, seed, and stone. A place could begin to outlast the people who first shaped it. That is why the age of such a settlement matters. Around this broad period of early settled life, human communities in different regions were experimenting with ways of living that would later make villages, farming communities, and eventually true cities possible. The process was uneven, local, and slow. It did not happen everywhere at once. It did not make life easier in every way. Settling could offer advantages, such as access to stored food, repeated use of shelters, and stronger ties to a known place. But it also created new burdens. People who stay must solve problems that moving people can sometimes leave behind. Waste collects. Food supplies must be protected. Water matters more sharply. Neighbours become permanent. Death, birth, sickness, repair, conflict, and cooperation all happen within a smaller circle. The body that evolved through long patterns of movement now had to live inside a denser human world. This is the quiet importance of a 9,000-year-old settlement beneath dry land. It belongs to a threshold, not only between wandering and staying, but between two ways of imagining security. In one older pattern, safety could mean knowing when to move. In a newer pattern, safety could mean making a place strong enough to remain. The buried walls show that, for a time, remaining worked. The settlement was not just a random pause in the landscape. It was a repeated choice made through labour and shared routines. Yet the very existence of abandonment tells us that remaining was never guaranteed. A place could hold people for generations and still lose the conditions that made it livable. Its water could become less reliable. Its food system could become strained. Its social life could grow heavier. Its surrounding landscape could change slowly enough that no one moment looked like the end. When archaeologists uncover such a place, they are not simply finding old buildings. They are finding the edge of a human experiment, the moment when people began to trust the ground beneath them, before history could write down what happened when that trust began to fail. The central question begins with a simple difficulty. A place that was built through repeated effort is not the same as a place that was merely visited. A temporary camp can be left because the season turns, because animals move, because water disappears for a few weeks, or because another valley becomes more useful. But a settlement with walls, floors, hearths, storage, and layers of repair belongs to a different relationship with land. It suggests that people expected return. They expected some part of tomorrow to resemble yesterday closely enough that labour spent in one place would still matter later. That expectation is one of the quiet foundations of settled life. It is also what makes abandonment so difficult to explain. When the people of a very early settlement finally stopped rebuilding, stopped sweeping floors, stopped lighting fires in the same rooms, and stopped placing new traces over old ones, they were not only leaving material behind, they were breaking a pattern that may have held families and generations together. We should not imagine this as a single dramatic morning when everyone looked at the walls and decided the place was finished. That is possible in some human histories, but it is not something we can assume for deep prehistory without evidence. More often, the end of a place may have been less like a door closing and more like a sound becoming softer. One household repairs less. Another spends more time elsewhere. A roof is not renewed. A child grows up and joins relatives in another settlement. A storage pit is left unused. A room fills with wind-blown earth. A path that used to be clear becomes faint. In this way, abandonment can be both real and hard to see from the inside. The people living through the change may not have thought of themselves as witnesses to the end of a world. They may have been solving ordinary problems, one after another, until the old place no longer held the centre of life. This is why the title's question should remain open at the beginning. The mystery is not only what happened, it is how many different kinds of pressure can gather around a human community before the place itself becomes less possible. A settlement can be weakened by the land around it. If rainfall patterns shift, if nearby plants change, if animals become harder to find, or if water becomes more uncertain, daily life must adjust. A settlement can also be weakened by its own success. More people can mean more hands, more shared knowledge and more protection, but also more mouths, more waste, more conflict, more need for fuel, and more pressure on the surrounding ground. Staying creates memory, but it also creates accumulation. Nothing is weightless. The food system, the water source, the walls, the dead, the living, the children, the aging, the sick, the tools, the paths, and the obligations between people all become part of the same fragile arrangement. The deeper we look into early settled life, the more we see that human beings did not simply discover stability and then keep it forever. They entered into a bargain with place. In exchange for shelter, stored food, and continuity, they accepted dependence on conditions that could change. This bargain began near the roots of the human story after long ages of movement. The human body still carried the needs of an older life, walking, searching, reading the land, responding to scarcity, adjusting to uncertainty, but the walls of early settlements asked that body to live with new forms of closeness and repetition. This is not a story of failure, it is a story of experiment. Some experiments lasted for many generations. Some became the ancestors of later villages and cities. Some were left behind, not because the people were foolish, but because every human arrangement depends on the world around it. The desert, when it later covers such a place, can make abandonment look sudden and absolute. It hides the gradual steps. It removes the voices that might have explained small decisions. It leaves us with the outline of rooms and the absence of those who once crossed them. That absence is powerful because it stands at the beginning of something we still live with now. Modern people also build as if our places will continue. We repair, store, name, inherit, and remember. We trust the ground beneath us in ways so ordinary that we rarely notice them. A 9,000-year-old settlement beneath dry earth reminds us that this trust has always been both necessary and uncertain. The first settled communities did not only teach humanity how to remain, they also left behind the harder lesson that even a place filled with labour, memory, and human presence can one day become silent. And the reason may not survive with the walls. Calling it a city is useful only if we let the word become strange again. Today, when we hear the word city, we usually imagine streets, markets, officials, written rules, districts, public buildings, and crowds moving through a space that has already become too large for every face to be familiar. We imagine a place organized by systems bigger than any household, but a settlement from around 9,000 years ago belongs to a time before many of those later features had appeared. It was not a city in the way a later Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or modern city would be a city. It did not need towers, monuments, written names, or royal power to matter. Its importance lies in something quieter and older. The fact that many human lives were gathered into a fixed place, long enough for walls to rise, floors to be remade, hearths to darken, and the same ground to carry layer after layer of use. The danger is that a modern word can make the past look more familiar than it really was. If we picture paved roads, a central palace, guards at gates, or a formal government, we may be importing a later world into a much earlier one. That would make the mystery easier to imagine, but less truthful. The people who lived in such an early settlement were not citizens in the modern sense. They were not writing their laws on tablets. They were not leaving behind official explanations of why they came, how they organized themselves, or why later generations moved away. Their world was built from other forms of order: kinship, daily labor, shared space, repeated practice, memory, food, water, animals, plants, the dead, and the living closeness of bodies inside a small human landscape. This does not make the place simple. In some ways, it makes it harder to understand. A later city may leave records that speak in the language of power. An early settlement speaks through the arrangement of rooms, the wear of floors, the remains of meals, the placement of burials, the reuse of walls, and the slow accumulation of ordinary acts. It tells us that human beings were learning how to live together in a denser way before the familiar signs of civilization had taken shape. That is why the phrase 9,000-year-old city can open a door, but the careful mind must step through slowly. What may have been found beneath a dry landscape is better understood as a large, early, settled human place, perhaps city-like in feeling because it concentrated people, memory, and labor, yet not a city by the full standards of later urban life. This difference matters because the question of abandonment changes depending on what we think the place was. If we imagine a modern city, we may expect a single collapse, a political failure, a conquered population, or a dramatic disaster. But if we imagine an early settled community, the possibilities become slower and more human. A place like this could be left because the balance that supported daily life gradually shifted. The land might have become less generous. Water might have become less dependable. Food practices might have changed. Social ties might have stretched outward to other communities. Younger people might have followed marriages, herds, fields, or opportunities elsewhere. Houses might have been rebuilt fewer times, until the settlement became a memory rather than a centre. None of this requires a single final catastrophe. It requires only the gradual weakening of reasons to stay. Near the beginning of settled human life, that distinction is essential. Early communities were not yet protected by the full machinery of later states. Their strength came from cooperation, knowledge of the local environment, and the ability to adjust. Their vulnerability came from the same sources. To stay in one place was to trust that the surrounding world would keep answering human needs. When that trust became harder to maintain, people may have done what humans had always known how to do: move, reorganize, and carry life elsewhere. So the buried place beneath the desert should not be forced into a modern image. It is more powerful when seen on its own terms. It was a human gathering before the age of written explanations, a place where the long history of movement began to settle into walls, and where the silence of abandonment still asks us to be careful with every word we use. A large early settlement would not have looked like the cities that fill our imagination now. It would have been lower, earthier, closer to the colour of the ground itself. The walls may have been made from mudbrick, packed earth, stone, timber, reeds, or whatever the local landscape allowed. Roofs may have been flat or simple, rebuilt again and again as weather, weight, smoke, and time wore them down. Rooms were not empty boxes. They held heat, ash, tools, food remains, sleeping places, repaired surfaces, and the marks of people who shaped their daily lives through small, repeated acts. A wall was not only a boundary, it was a decision to stay long enough for a boundary to matter. A hearth was not only a place for fire, it was the repeated centre of warmth, cooking, light, and gathering. A floor was not only hard ground, it was a surface that bodies crossed so often that it became part of memory. In such a place, the human world would have been compressed. People may have lived close together, with houses packed near one another, paths narrow or informal, and daily sound travelling easily through shared space. There may not have been streets in the later urban sense. Movement may have followed rooftops, openings, courtyards, passages, or familiar routes known through habit rather than signs. The settlement would have been organised, but not necessarily by written law or central authority. Its order may have come from use, where food was prepared, where tools were stored, where children stayed near adults, where refuse was thrown away, where the dead were placed, where animals were kept or processed, where people repaired what the season damaged. To us, from far away, these arrangements can seem simple because they lack monuments. But the absence of monuments does not mean the absence of complexity. It may mean that complexity lived in ordinary things. A storage space changes the future because it allows food to wait. A repaired wall changes time because it means someone expected tomorrow to happen in the same place. A shared hearth changes social life because it draws bodies into patterns of closeness. A roof changes sleep because it separates the body from open sky, wind, insects, and cold. These are quiet inventions, but they reach deep into human history. They belong to the moment when the old moving body began to live inside a more fixed human container. The people there still depended on the surrounding land. They needed water. They needed plants, animals, fuel, stone, clay, fibre, and knowledge of seasons. Their settlement was never separate from the wider environment. It was like a knot tied in the landscape, holding many human needs together in one place. If the knot held, generations could return to the same walls. If it tightened too much, daily life could become harder. If the surrounding world changed, the whole arrangement could begin to loosen. This is why the physical details matter. A small room, a worn floor, a burnt patch of earth, a storage bin, a grinding stone, an animal bone, or a seed trapped in old soil can tell us that life was not an abstract mystery. It was made of work. It was made of bodies bending, carrying, cooking, sleeping, waking, repairing, and learning. It was made of people who had inherited a long human past of movement, but were now placing more of their effort into one ground. A large early settlement beneath dry earth may feel dramatic because it seems to appear suddenly from silence, but for those who lived there, it was probably not dramatic in that way. It was home, or something close to home, built out of repeated necessity. The mystery of abandonment grows stronger when we imagine this carefully. People did not leave behind empty architecture. They left behind a whole pattern of life. Every wall that survived was once part of a decision to remain. Every floor that survived was once crossed by someone whose name is gone. Every trace of fire was once a small defense against darkness, hunger, and cold. When the settlement finally stopped being renewed, it was not only buildings that faded. A human rhythm faded with them, and the desert kept the shape after the rhythm was gone. The most remarkable thing about an early settlement is not always its size. Size can impress the eye, but size alone does not explain why the place matters. A large camp, a seasonal gathering, or a temporary shelter can also cover ground. What makes a deep prehistoric settlement feel different is the density of human commitment. People were not simply passing through. They were arranging life around return. They were making space predictable enough that daily habits could gather around it. In that sense, the real wonder is not that walls existed, but that human beings had begun to build a world where walls could become part of memory. This was one of the quiet turning points near the roots of settled life. Long before written history, long before rulers could carve their names into stone, people were learning that survival could be organized not only by movement, but also by repetition. A hearth could be lit again. A floor could be cleaned again. A roof could be repaired again. A storage place could hold food for a later need. These repeated acts changed the meaning of time. The future was no longer only somewhere ahead on the path. It could also be inside the same room, waiting for the next morning. That is why the absence of wealth or monuments should not make such a place seem less important. Later civilizations often announce themselves through scale: temples, palaces, walls of defense, roads, tombs, and written records. Early settled communities announced themselves more softly. They left behind ash, seeds, stone tools, plastered surfaces, bones, post holes, packed floors, and traces of repair. These things do not shout, but they speak with a deeper patience. They show that people were making a durable human arrangement before the familiar image of civilization had fully formed. The settlement was not great because it looked like a later capital. It was great because it shows the beginning of a new pressure in human life, how to live close to others, in the same place, across time. That pressure was not only practical, it was social, biological, and emotional. Though we must be careful not to claim the private feelings of people whose words are gone. We can say only that closeness changes life. When families live near one another for long periods, work becomes shared in new ways. Food preparation, tool-making, childcare, repair, disposal of waste, treatment of the dead, and access to water all become part of a common rhythm. The surrounding landscape is no longer just a place to move through. It becomes a support system for a concentrated human community. Fuel must come from somewhere. Clay must be gathered. Stones must be selected. Plants must be collected, cultivated, processed, or stored. Animals must be hunted, managed, or watched. The settlement stands only because the wider land keeps feeding it. This creates a strange balance. The more successful the place becomes, the more it depends on many conditions staying within a livable range. A small mobile group can sometimes respond to scarcity by moving more easily. A settled community has more to carry in another sense. It carries walls, stored goods, social ties, buried dead, repaired houses, familiar paths, and the memory of generations. To leave such a place is not like walking away from an overnight shelter. It is a much heavier act, even if it happens slowly. This is why the discovery of a place beneath dry earth can feel so unsettling without needing exaggeration. The buildings do not prove a lost kingdom. The ruins do not need a secret ruler or a hidden disaster to matter. They matter because they show a human experiment at the edge of what would later become village life, farming life, and eventually urban life. The people who lived there were close to the beginning of a long transformation that still shapes us. Modern life is built from the same basic wager, that staying, storing, repairing, and cooperating will make tomorrow more secure than wandering alone. Yet the buried settlement reminds us that the wager has never been simple. A place can be carefully made, repeatedly renewed, and deeply woven into daily life, and still become empty. The most important lesson is not that early people failed. It is that settlement itself was never a guarantee. It was a fragile achievement, held together by land, bodies, food, water, labor, memory, and time. When those elements no longer fit together, even a place that once felt permanent could become part of the desert's silence. A desert can deceive the eye, because it looks finished. The open ground, the pale horizon, the hard wind, and the dry silence all seem to say that this place has always been what it is now. When we imagine a settlement buried beneath such land, it is easy to picture people forcing life into a world that was already empty and hostile. But ancient landscapes rarely stay the same for as long as human memory wishes they would. The place that appears dry today may have passed through older seasons of water, grass, shrubs, animals, and usable ground. A desert is not only a place, it can also be the late face of a landscape that has changed many times. This matters because no early human community could build a lasting settlement by ignoring its surroundings. People did not simply choose a location and decide to endure it for mystery's sake. They needed water close enough to reach, plants worth gathering or managing, animals in the wider region, material for building, fuel for fire, and paths that connected them to other useful places. If a settlement existed for generations, then for some period, the landscape around it must have answered enough of these needs to make staying possible. That does not mean it was lush, easy, or safe. It only means that the balance between people and place had not yet broken. Around the early Holocene, after the coldest phases of the Ice Age had passed, many regions experienced environmental changes that affected where people could live and how they could find food. These changes were not uniform. Some areas became more favorable for certain plants and animals. Others remained difficult. Some shifted gradually between wetter and drier conditions. The important point is not to turn climate into a single, simple explanation, but to remember that the ground beneath an abandoned settlement may contain the memory of a different world. What is now sand, stone, and thirst may once have been a margin where life gathered just enough to support a community. Early settled people lived inside those margins. Their houses depended on the land the way a nest depends on branches, mud, shelter, and the season. The walls may have stood in one place, but the life of the settlement extended outward into water sources, fields, wild stands of grain, grazing areas, hunting grounds, clay deposits, woodlands, and routes known by repeated use. This is where the human beginning returns to the story. Before settlements, the deep inheritance of our species was movement through changing environments. Human beings survived because they could notice, remember, cooperate, and adjust. A fixed settlement did not erase that inheritance. It placed it under new pressure. The knowledge that once helped people move through a landscape now had to help them keep one place alive. If rain came differently, if plants shifted, if animals moved away, if nearby fuel became scarce, the settlement would feel those changes as daily difficulty. A dry season might mean more than discomfort. It could mean longer walks, smaller stores, more pressure on shared resources, and more careful decisions about who went where and when. From a distance of 9,000 years, it may be impossible to say which change mattered most, but it is reasonable to see that the desert around a buried settlement should not be treated as a fixed stage. It was part of the story, changing slowly, shaping choices, and perhaps one day making old habits harder to continue. The walls may have been built during a time when the surrounding world still offered enough support. Later, the same ground may have become less forgiving. The people did not need to witness a sudden catastrophe for the place to lose its hold on them. They only needed to find, over time, that the old relationship between water, food, labor, and return no longer worked as well as before. A desert can preserve the outline of a settlement, but it can also hide the living landscape that once made the settlement possible. Beneath the dry surface, the deeper question remains, not only why people left, but what kind of world first allowed them to stay. Climate is often imagined as a background, something behind human history rather than inside it. But for early settled communities, climate was not distant. It entered the body through hunger, thirst, heat, cold, effort, and uncertainty. A shift in rainfall could become a longer walk to water. A change in vegetation could become less fuel for cooking or less cover for animals. A season that arrived differently could disturb the timing of seeds, grazing, gathering, and stored food. In a mobile way of life, people could sometimes respond to these changes by widening their range, following animals or returning later when a place became useful again. A settled community had less freedom of that kind. The houses stayed where they were. The hearths stayed where they were. The storage spaces stayed where they were. The dead, in some traditions, stayed close to the living. The entire human arrangement began to depend on the surrounding world remaining reliable enough for return. This is why the climate of the early Holocene matters. After the last ice age, the Earth did not move into one simple, peaceful condition. It moved through a period of warming, shifting rainfall, changing plant communities, moving animal ranges, and new ecological openings in different regions. In some places, these changes helped make more settled life possible. Plants that people had long known could become more predictable. Water might gather in useful places. Animals might move through familiar routes. Wild grains, nuts, fruits, roots, and other resources could support repeated occupation. In other places, or at later moments in the same places, the balance could change again. A community that began during a more favorable phase might continue into a drier or less predictable one. The settlement would then carry old expectations into a new environment. This does not mean that climate alone explains abandonment. That would be too simple and often too confident. Archaeology rarely gives us permission to reduce a human place to one cause. People are not passive objects moved by weather. They adapt. They change diet, change tools, shift routes, trade, store more carefully, cooperate differently, or send some members elsewhere. But climate can press on every other part of life. It can turn small weaknesses into heavier burdens. If water becomes less reliable, food storage matters more. If food storage becomes harder, social trust matters more. If social trust weakens, the pressure of scarcity becomes sharper. If fuel must be gathered from farther away, daily labor grows. If children, older people, or the sick require care during difficult seasons, the settlement must absorb that strain. No single change has to destroy a place. A web of changes can make staying feel less workable with each generation. This is especially important near the beginning of settled human life. Human beings had already survived enormous environmental changes long before the first large settlements. Our species carried a deep history of flexibility. People knew how to move, watch, learn, and adjust. But settlement changed the scale of adjustment. A small group on the move could alter its path. A built place could not move its walls. The more a community invested in one location, the more it had to make that location continue to work. A storage bin is useful because tomorrow is expected to need what today can save. A repaired roof is useful because the household expects to return under it. A field, a herd, a water source, a gathering ground, or a path becomes part of a repeated pattern. When the climate shifts, it does not only change nature outside the settlement, it changes the meaning of all these investments. The same house that once represented security may begin to represent weight. The same stored food that once gave confidence may begin to show how narrow the margin has become. The same path to water may become a measure of increasing difficulty. This is why a buried settlement beneath a dry landscape feels so haunting. It may have begun in a world that offered enough promise for people to stay. It may have continued through years when effort and cooperation kept the balance alive. Then, perhaps slowly, the wider environment may have become harder to read, harder to trust, or harder to depend on. We cannot say that this is the only answer. We should not pretend the ground has given us a confession, but we can say that climate was not merely scenery. It was part of the settlement's breath. It shaped the distance between the house and the water, between the seed and the meal, between the season and the stored future. If the balance changed, then abandonment may not have begun with panic. It may have begun with longer walks, thinner margins, and the quiet realization that the place which once made life possible was asking for more than it could give back. A place does not become abandoned at the same moment it becomes difficult. Human beings are patient with places that matter to them. They repair. They adjust. They remember better seasons. They change small habits before they change a whole life. This is why a settlement born from a more favorable landscape may survive long after the first signs of strain appear. The people living there may have known years when water was easier, plants were more dependable, animals came closer, fuel was not so distant, and the surrounding land answered human effort more generously. Then, across time, the balance may have shifted. Not necessarily in one dramatic event, not necessarily in a disaster that left a clean mark in the soil. More often, a place can become harder through accumulation. A dry season reaches farther into the year. A familiar source of water becomes less certain. The useful plants around the settlement grow thinner or more scattered. Herd animals move differently. Soil near the settlement is used again and again. Fuel has to be gathered from farther away. Each change, alone, might be manageable. Together, they begin to alter the meaning of staying. The settlement that once gathered life may begin to gather effort. This is one of the quiet ways an early human place could move from promise to burden. At first, the walls may still stand. The hearths may still burn. Children may still learn the familiar routes. Adults may still know where to find stone, clay, food, water, and wood. The old knowledge does not disappear because conditions change, but knowledge has limits when the landscape itself begins to answer differently. A community can adapt only if the cost of adaptation remains bearable. Longer walks can be endured for a season. Smaller harvests can be managed for a time. Scarcer fuel can be rationed. More careful storage can help. But if every solution adds a new weight, then the old place slowly becomes less protective. The same fixed life that once created security begins to reduce freedom. This is the deep paradox of settlement near the beginning of human history. To stay is to gain continuity. But to stay is also to become tied to a particular set of conditions. A mobile group can sometimes follow shifting resources more easily, though movement has its own dangers and costs. A settled community has a different problem. It has walls that cannot walk, floors that cannot follow rain, storage rooms that depend on future supply, and social memory rooted in one ground. When that ground changes, the people must either make the place work again or loosen their attachment to it. Abandonment may begin in that loosening. It may begin when return becomes less certain, when repair is delayed, when some households spend more time elsewhere, when younger people build ties beyond the old settlement, when a path leading away becomes more important than a path leading back. None of this needs to look like collapse from inside daily life. It may look like ordinary survival. Someone follows animals farther than before. Someone visits relatives in another place and stays longer. Someone decides not to rebuild a damaged roof immediately. A family stores less because there is less to store. A room that once held activity becomes a place for dust. The settlement is still there, but its centre begins to weaken. Archaeology may later see only the result, the last use of a hearth, the final layer of occupation, the point after which no one renewed the floor. What it cannot easily show is the slow change in confidence. At the origin of settled life, confidence was everything. People stayed because the land, the group, and the future seemed connected enough to justify labour in one place. If the environment that once supported that connection became less forgiving, then leaving may not have meant defeat. It may have been another form of adaptation, older than settlement itself. The human body and mind had been shaped through long ages of response to changing worlds. Movement was not a failure. It was one of humanity's oldest answers. So when we look at a dry landscape covering an ancient settlement, the mystery should not be imagined only as a sudden end. It may be the trace of a longer conversation between people and place, in which the place first said yes often enough for walls to rise, and later answered with silence often enough for those walls to be left behind. The cost of staying is easy to miss because walls look protective. A wall keeps out wind, a roof softens the night, a hearth gathers warmth into one small circle, a storage space turns today's food into tomorrow's hope. From a distance, these things seem like pure progress, and in many ways they were. But every shelter also creates an inside, and every inside must be managed. When people live close together for a long time, the problems they once left behind on the path begin to remain with them. Ash collects. Broken tools collect. Food scraps collect. Human waste must go somewhere. Smoke darkens surfaces. Insects find stored grain, skins, fibres, and sleeping places. Rodents may be drawn toward the same food that protects people from hunger. Water has to be carried, shared, protected, or found again when the nearest source weakens. A settlement does not only gather people, it gathers consequences. This is one of the quiet truths behind early settled life. To remain in one place is not simply to stop moving. It is to accept a new kind of labour, the labour of keeping a place livable after human presence has already changed it. A mobile group can sometimes leave behind the refuse of a short stay and return later, when weather, animals, and time have softened the trace. A settled group must live near the trace. The ground remembers too quickly. A hearth used again and again becomes useful, but it also produces ash. A room used again and again becomes familiar, but it also needs cleaning, repair, and renewal. Food stored against scarcity becomes security, but it also becomes a target for pests and spoilage. The same closeness that allows cooperation also increases friction. People hear one another, smell one another, depend on one another, and cannot always escape one another easily. This does not mean early settlement was unhealthy in one simple way, or that people did not understand cleanliness, repair, and order in their own practical terms. It only means that staying created problems that movement had often helped to solve. Near the beginning of settled human life, the body entered a more crowded world. The human body had a long past shaped by walking, carrying, foraging, hunting, gathering, resting in temporary shelters, and responding to the land as it changed. It was not designed for one perfect lifestyle, and we should be careful with such words. Human beings are flexible. That flexibility is one reason our species survived so widely, but flexibility does not remove cost. When many bodies live near the same floors, hearths, stored foods, animals, tools, refuse areas, and water sources, daily life begins to press on the body in new ways. Smoke may enter the lungs more often. Stored food may change diet and labour. Close living may make some infections easier to spread, especially where people, animals, insects, waste, and water meet in tight spaces. Heavy work does not disappear just because people have walls. Carrying water, grinding plant foods, collecting fuel, repairing structures, preparing meals, tending children, processing hides, shaping tools, and maintaining the settlement can all become repeated burdens. The place protects the body, but it also asks the body to serve it. This is why early settlement should not be imagined as a simple climb from hardship into comfort. It was more like a trade. People gained continuity, storage, shared labour, and a stronger claim on familiar ground. In return, they accepted accumulation, maintenance, crowding, dependency, and a more permanent relationship with waste, pests, smoke, and social tension. The buried settlement beneath the dry earth may preserve walls that seem calm now, but those walls once held the ordinary pressure of many lives trying to remain together. Every room had to be made livable again and again. Every shared space had to absorb the small disorder of hunger, weather, illness, birth, aging, cooking, death, repair, and sleep. If the surrounding environment later became harder, these inner pressures would not vanish. They would grow heavier. Less water makes cleaning harder. Less fuel changes cooking and warmth. Less food makes storage more anxious. More people make space tighter. None of these details alone can explain why a settlement was abandoned, and we should not pretend they do. But they show why the question is deeper than a single lost event. A place can become difficult not only because something attacks it from outside, but because remaining itself becomes harder to sustain. The first settled communities were learning how to hold human life in one place, and the price of that lesson was written into the ground long before anyone could write it in words. The biological cost of settlement begins with a simple fact. Human bodies are living systems, not separate from the spaces they inhabit. A body carries water, breathes air, eats food, sheds skin, releases waste, gives off heat, catches infections, recovers, weakens, and depends on other bodies for care. When people move through a wide landscape, many of these traces are spread across distance. When people stay close together, the traces gather. This gathering does not make settled life wrong or unnatural in a simple sense. Human beings are unusually adaptable, and early communities found practical ways to clean, repair, store, separate, burn, bury, and manage the materials of daily life. But the body does not stop being vulnerable because a wall has been built around it. In some ways, the wall changes the shape of vulnerability. A person sleeping under a roof may be safer from cold wind or open exposure, yet more exposed to smoke from repeated indoor fires. A household with stored food may be safer from a bad day of gathering, yet more exposed to pests, spoilage, or the pressure of defending that store. A child growing near many adults may receive care from more hands, yet also live closer to the coughs, waste, insects, animals, and shared surfaces that come with dense life. These are not dramatic images, but they are deeply important because the earlier settled communities had to discover them without written medical theory, without modern sanitation, and without the later infrastructure that large towns would slowly develop. The human body had come from a much older story. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived by reading changing environments, using movement as one of their main tools of survival. Movement did not remove danger. It brought hunger, injury, weather, predators, uncertainty, and exhaustion. But it also spread risk. If one place became foul, empty, dangerous, or unlucky, people could often shift their attention elsewhere. Settlement reduced that kind of escape. It created a stronger relationship between the body and a particular location. The lungs breathed the smoke of familiar fires. The feet crossed the same floors. The hands used the same grinding stones, the same tools, the same storage areas, the same paths to water. Repetition gave life structure, but it also repeated strain. Grinding plant foods could mean long hours of pressure through hands, arms, shoulders, and back. Carrying water could turn distance into a daily burden. Collecting fuel could require longer journeys if nearby vegetation thinned. Living near animals where that occurred could bring warmth, food, labour, and resources, but also new contact between species, waste, insects, and disease pathways. Close human life also changes the meaning of sickness. In a small moving group, an illness may still spread, but the scale and pattern of contact are different. In a denser settlement, more bodies share air, objects, food spaces, sleeping areas, and care routines. Archaeology cannot always tell us exactly which infections move through a community, and we must not invent certainty where evidence is absent. Yet it is widely understood that settled life, population density, stored food, animal proximity, and waste management created new conditions in which disease could matter differently. This does not mean that one epidemic emptied the ancient place beneath the desert. It means that the body became part of the settlement's hidden balance. Health was not only an individual matter, it was connected to water, food, smoke, crowding, animals, insects, labor, birth, death, and the ability of the group to keep daily life clean enough, fed enough, and stable enough to continue. At the origin of settled life, people were not simply building houses. They were building a new biological environment around themselves. The house protected the body from some old dangers while introducing quieter pressures that did not always leave clear marks. A wall can survive long after the breath inside it is gone. A floor can survive after the knees that bent over it have turned to dust. A hearth can remain after the smoke has vanished from the air. This is why the abandoned settlement should be understood not only as architecture, but as a former habitat for human bodies. If the balance held, the place could support life across generations. If the balance weakened, the body would feel it first, through tiredness, thirst, hunger, coughing, carrying, crowding, and the slow narrowing of what daily life could bear. Perhaps no single pressure was enough to end the settlement, but many small biological costs, repeated long enough, could make the promise of staying feel less certain. It would be too easy to say that disease destroyed the settlement. It would be too clean, too simple, and probably too confident. Human history is full of illness, but illness is not always the key that unlocks every abandoned place. A cough does not write its own explanation into a wall. A fever does not always leave a clear mark in the floor. Even bones, when they survive, do not tell every story of weakness, recovery, fear, care, or loss. For a settlement from deep prehistory, before written records, disease can be considered only as one possible pressure among many. It may have mattered, it may have shaped daily life, it may have made crowded living harder, but it should not be turned into a final answer unless the evidence clearly allows it. The more careful view is quieter. Living close together created conditions in which sickness, hygiene, insects, animals, food storage, waste, smoke, and water all became tied to the survival of the place. That is enough to make the settlement more complex without inventing a dramatic plague. The important point is not that one invisible enemy suddenly ended everything. The important point is that settled life changed the relationship between human bodies and the environment around them. A mobile group could leave a used campsite behind. A settled community had to keep living with the results of its own presence. The same paths were walked again. The same water source was used again. The same hearths burned again. The same storage spaces attracted attention from people, insects, rodents, and time. The same refuse areas had to be managed. The same walls held warmth, smoke, smell, and breath. These repeated contacts may not sound like a catastrophe, but they form the background of health. If water became less clean, if food stores spoiled, if pests increased, if people lived closer during harsh seasons, if animals were kept nearby, or if smoke filled enclosed spaces more often, the body would carry the cost before any archaeologist could later name the cause. Near the beginning of settled life, this was a new kind of human problem. Older human survival had depended on movement, attention, and flexibility across a wide landscape. Settlement did not remove those older skills, but it asked them to serve a fixed place. People had to notice not only where animals moved or where plants ripened, but also how their own community was changing the ground beneath it. They had to manage the waste of living, the storage of food, the repair of houses, the closeness of neighbors, and the unseen risks that came from remaining. This kind of pressure can be difficult to recognize because it does not always look like danger from the outside. A house filled with people can look secure. A storage room can look like safety. A thick wall can look like protection, but safety can become burden when the conditions around it shift. If a household must spend more time fetching water, less time producing food, more time caring for the sick, more time cleaning, more time repairing, and more time defending stored resources from spoilage or pests, the settlement still exists, but its promise has changed. It begins to require more life than it gives back. This is why abandonment may have many roots. Disease alone may not explain it. Climate alone may not explain it. Food alone may not explain it. Social tension alone may not explain it. But all of them can touch one another. A drier environment can make water more precious. Scarcer water can make cleanliness harder. Poorer storage can make hunger sharper. Hunger can weaken bodies. Weakened bodies can make labour harder. Harder labour can make repair slower. Slower repair can make houses less livable. Less livable houses can make leaving more reasonable. None of these steps needs to be sudden. None needs to announce itself as the end. They can unfold inside ordinary days, hidden inside tasks that still look normal from a distance. A person carries water. A person sweeps a floor. A person tends a fire. A person repairs a wall. A person coughs through smoke. A person walks farther for fuel than someone once had to walk. A person decides, perhaps only for a season, to spend more time somewhere else. The settlement remains, but the balance has shifted. The deepest truth may be that early settled life was not fragile because people were weak. It was fragile because it joined many living systems together. Land, water, food, bodies, animals, fire, waste, memory, and cooperation all had to remain within reach of one another. When they did, a place could hold human life for generations. When they did not, the wisest answer may have been the oldest one our species knew: to move before the place took too much. A wall is one of the most patient things human beings can leave behind. It does not remember a name, but it can hold the outline of a room after every voice has disappeared. A floor does not explain who crossed it, but it can keep the pressure of repeated life in its layers. A hearth cannot tell us what was cooked, who sat nearby, or whether the fire was lit on a cold morning or an ordinary evening, but it can leave ash, charcoal, heat marks, burnt clay, and a darker circle in the earth. This is how archaeology begins to listen to a place that cannot speak. It does not receive a confession from the past. It receives fragments: a line of stone, a packed surface, a broken tool, a seed that survived by accident, a bone with a cut mark, a piece of plaster, a storage pit, a shape in the ground where a post once stood. Each fragment is small, but together they form the remains of human routine. In a settlement buried beneath dry land, these traces become especially powerful because they show that people did not simply pass by. They organized space. They returned to the same places. They made fire in chosen spots. They prepared food. They repaired walls. They shaped rooms around the needs of bodies. They left behind the material grammar of staying. Yet none of these traces tells the whole story. A wall can show that people built, but not exactly why they built there. A hearth can show that people cooked, but not what the meal meant to them. A storage place can show preparation for the future, but not whether that future felt safe or uncertain. An animal bone can show contact with food, hunting, herding, butchery, or disposal, depending on its context, but it cannot alone explain the social world around it. A seed can suggest plants used by the community, yet it does not tell us the full landscape from which that plant came. The evidence is real, but it is partial. This is where the mystery becomes more honest. The ruins do not hide everything, but they also do not reveal everything. They give us the outer shape of life, without the inner voice that would have made the place clear. In a later written society, a clay tablet, inscription, or official record might preserve a dispute, a tax, a king, a drought, a boundary, a prayer, or a date. In a settlement from deep prehistory, before writing, the record is quieter and more physical. The ground becomes the archive, layers become pages, objects become sentences without grammar. Archaeologists read by comparing, measuring, excavating carefully, and placing each find in relation to the others. A stone blade near an animal bone may mean something different from the same blade in a refuse area or near a floor. Ash in a hearth means something different from ash spread through a collapsed building. A repaired wall means something different from a wall left broken and covered by wind-blown soil. Meaning comes from context, and context must be protected slowly. This is why excavation is not simply digging. It is controlled attention. Every layer removed can never be put back exactly as it was. Every object loses part of its meaning if separated from the place where it rested. The deeper human origin remains present in this careful work. Long before history was written, human beings left their lives in the ground through action, not explanation. They moved, settled, ate, slept, buried, burned, built, broke, and repaired. The body made marks before language became a record. When we look at a buried settlement, we are not looking at a single dramatic secret. We are looking at the residue of many ordinary acts, repeated until they became archaeological evidence. This makes the abandoned place feel even more silent. The walls survived, but the conversations did not. The floors survived, but the footsteps are gone. The hearth survived, but the warmth is gone. The tools survived, but the hands are gone. What remains is enough to prove presence, effort, and organization, but not enough to give a final answer. The place shows that people were there. It shows that they stayed. It shows that they built a world close to the ground. But when we ask why that world was eventually left behind, the evidence answers only in fragments. And the silence between those fragments is where the deepest question begins. Archaeology is a science of patience because the past rarely gives itself in the form we most desire. We may want a voice. We may want a sentence. We may want someone from the settlement to say, plainly, why the houses were built, how people lived inside them, what changed, who left first, and why no one returned in the same way. But the older the human place, the less likely it is to offer that kind of answer. Before writing, before official memory, before names were fixed into durable signs, life was recorded by matter rather than speech. A person could make a tool, light a fire, carry water, grind food, repair a wall, place a body in the ground, or throw away a broken object. Those actions could survive in fragments. The reason behind them often could not. This does not make archaeology weak, it makes it careful. A good archaeological interpretation does not pretend that every trace is a full confession. It asks what can be known, what can be reasonably inferred, and what must remain uncertain. In a buried settlement, the soil may preserve a sequence of flaws, showing that a house was remade again and again. That may suggest continuity, return, and investment. But it does not tell us whether the people felt secure, anxious, proud, trapped, or simply practical. A concentration of ash may show repeated burning. It may belong to cooking, heating, craft activity, cleaning, destruction, or some combination of uses, depending on its context. A group of animal bones may show what people ate, hunted, herded, processed, or discarded. Yet bones alone cannot explain every decision about food, scarcity, preference, ritual, or necessity. A storage pit may reveal planning, but not the feeling of the person who filled it. A doorway, roof opening, or narrow passage may reveal movement through space, but not the full social meaning of who could enter, who could leave, and who belonged. The earth gives evidence, not autobiography. That difference matters deeply when we ask why a settlement was abandoned. The final phase of occupation may show fewer repairs, changed use of rooms, more refuse, collapsed structures, or a shift in material remains. These signs can suggest that life was changing, but the exact human story behind that change may still be hidden. Perhaps people left in stages. Perhaps some families remained while others moved. Perhaps the place became seasonal before it became empty. Perhaps another settlement nearby became more important. Perhaps environmental pressure, social change, disease, food stress, or shifting routes all touch the same decision. Archaeology can test possibilities, compare patterns, and reject claims that do not fit the evidence. But it cannot honestly turn every silence into certainty. Near the beginning of settled human life, this humility is not a weakness. It is the only way to remain truthful. The people who lived there belonged to the long human story before written memory. Their lives were not less meaningful because they left no text. They were simply preserved differently. The body was the first recorder. Hands shaped clay, stone, wood, fibre, food, and walls. Feet wore paths into surfaces. Smoke darkened ceilings and hearths. Teeth, bones, seeds, shells, pigments, and tools entered the ground as quiet witnesses. Human presence became visible through use, not explanation. To read such a place is to follow the marks left by living bodies while resisting the urge to place modern thoughts inside them. We can say that they cooked because fire and food survive. We can say they built because structures remain. We can say they returned because layers show repeated occupation. We can say they depended on the landscape because no settlement can exist without water, food, fuel, materials, and roots beyond itself. But when we come to the final reason for leaving, we have to move more slowly. The ground may show pressure. It may show change. It may show a pattern that looks like decline, reorganization, or departure. Yet it may not show a single answer. This is why the silence of a prehistoric settlement is not empty. It is disciplined silence. It asks the listener to accept that human history did not begin as a clear written story. It began as traces, habits, bodies, and places. A buried wall is not mute because it has nothing to say. It is mute because it speaks in a language that must be translated with care. Each object can be honest and incomplete at the same time. Each layer can bring us closer to daily life while leaving the deepest motives beyond reach. The abandoned settlement beneath the desert therefore teaches us something before it teaches us why it was abandoned. It teaches us how little of a human world needs to survive for us to feel its presence, and how much can disappear before we understand its end. Sometimes the most important evidence is not the object that survives, but the gap around it. A buried settlement may give us walls, floors, hearths, tools, bones, seeds, and traces of repair, yet still withhold the thing we want most. The reason life changed. The absence can be more powerful than the remains. There may be no burned layer wide enough to prove a sudden destruction, no written warning, no final message, no clear sign that every household left on the same day. No single object that says the water failed, the food system broke, the social order weakened, or the people chose another place. Instead, the archaeologist may find a quieter pattern, fewer signs of renewal, rooms used differently, debris collecting where careful maintenance once happened, structures no longer repaired, or later deposits slowly covering what had once been active ground. These patterns matter, but they do not speak in one voice. They suggest change without always naming its cause. That is where the mystery becomes more honest and more difficult. Human beings often prefer a clean ending. We want the ancient place to fall because of one drought, one disaster, one invasion, one illness, one mistake. A single cause makes the story easier to hold, but early settled life was not held together by one thread. It depended on many threads at once: water, food, fuel, weather, soil, animals, storage, labor, health, relationships, births, deaths, paths, memory, and the willingness of people to keep returning. If one thread weakened, the others might still hold. If several weakened slowly, the whole pattern might become harder to maintain without leaving a dramatic scar. The ground can preserve a wall, but not the gradual loss of confidence that may have passed through a community over many seasons. It can preserve a hearth, but not the moment when a family began cooking somewhere else more often. It can preserve a storage pit, but not the worry that came when there was less to place inside it. It can preserve a path in fragments, but not the decision to follow that path farther away and return less often. This is why what is missing must be treated as evidence too, though very carefully. The lack of a clear destruction layer may argue against a simple violent end, but it does not prove peace. The lack of writing means we cannot hear the community explain itself, but it does not mean the people had no memory or meaning. The lack of a single obvious cause does not mean nothing happened. It means the past may have been shaped by processes that were slow, mixed, and uneven. Near the beginning of settled human life, such processes would have been especially important. People were learning how to make one place carry more of life's weight than before. They were asking the land to support repeated return, and asking the group to maintain shared spaces across time. That arrangement could hold for generations. Yet it could also weaken without any one event announcing the end. A little less water, a little more distance to fuel, a little more pressure on food, a little more crowding, a little more sickness, a few more households with ties elsewhere, a few less repairs, a few rooms left unused. None of these alone must equal abandonment. Together, across time, they can change a living place into a remembered one. The silence of missing evidence also protects us from false certainty. It reminds us that prehistoric people should not be reduced to characters in a story we invent for them. They were not waiting to explain themselves to us. They were living within their own conditions, solving their own problems, and carrying forward knowledge that had grown from a much older human past. When they left, whether slowly or in sharper stages, they may have been doing what people had always done when a place no longer answered enough needs: adjusting. The settlement beneath dry earth does not tell us everything. It gives us presence, labour, skill, and absence. It shows that humans once made a durable world there, and that the world did not remain durable forever. What we do not find may be the most truthful part of the story, because it forces the question to stay open where the evidence leaves it. Food is one of the quiet foundations of every abandoned place. A wall can stand only if the bodies around it are fed often enough to keep building, repairing, carrying, cooking, and returning. A hearth can burn only if people have something to place over the fire. A storage space means nothing unless the wider landscape can fill it again. When we look at an early settlement buried beneath dry ground, it is easy to focus on the architecture because walls survive more clearly than meals. But the life of the place depended on a more fragile system: how people turned the surrounding world into daily nourishment. Around the time when some communities began to stay longer in one place, food was changing from something found only through movement into something increasingly organized around return. This did not happen in one simple step. It did not happen everywhere in the same way. Some groups continued hunting, gathering, fishing, and moving through seasonal routes. Some began to manage plants more closely. Some kept animals near them or interacted with herds in ways that slowly changed both human life and animal life. Some used wild resources and cultivated resources together. The boundary between foraging and farming was not a clean line drawn in one generation. It was a long, uneven process shaped by local landscapes, inherited knowledge, and many small choices. That is why we must be careful when speaking about a 9,000-year-old settlement. It may belong to a world where people were experimenting with more reliable food systems, but that does not mean their lives had become easy or fully agricultural in the later sense. The older human inheritance was still present. People still needed to know seasons, animal movement, plant growth, water, weather, stone, wood, and distance. But now, some of that knowledge was being gathered around a fixed place. Food could be stored. Plants could be processed in repeated spaces. Tools for grinding, cutting, scraping, and cooking could remain near the same houses. The settlement became not only a place to sleep, but a center where food passed through many transformations. Seeds might become flour, grain might become porridge or bread-like food, meat might be cut, dried, cooked, shared or discarded. Nuts, fruits, roots, and gathered plants might move from the outside landscape into rooms, baskets, pits, and hearths. Bones and shells might accumulate in refuse areas. Ash and burnt seeds might enter the soil. These traces are humble, but they are central. They show that the settlement survived through repeated success in feeding human bodies. Yet food systems bring dependence as well as security. A mobile group can sometimes follow food across a wider range, though that life carries its own risk. A settled group begins to ask more from the same surrounding area. If people store more food, they must protect it. If they process more plants, they need tools, labour, and fuel. If they depend more on certain species, then changes in those species matter more sharply. If they return to the same land year after year, the health of that land becomes tied to the health of the community. Staying does not remove hunger from human life. It changes how hunger arrives. Instead of only asking where food can be found today, people must also ask whether enough can be gathered, grown, managed, preserved, and defended for later. This is one of the deep shifts near the origin of settled life. Time entered food in a new way, A meal was no longer only a response to the present, it could become part of a planned future. A storage pit was a promise that today's work might protect tomorrow's body, but every promise can fail if the conditions around it change. Rainfall, soil, pests, animal movement, disease among animals, conflict over access, labor shortages, and social obligations could all affect the flow of food into a settlement. We do not need to claim that one failed harvest or one lost herd emptied the place. That would be too certain. What matters is that food had become a system, and systems can weaken in many places at once. A little less yield, a longer walk to gather fuel, more mouths to feed, less wild food nearby, more pressure on stored supplies, more time spent processing hard foods, more effort needed to maintain fields, animals, or gathering routes. Each detail may look ordinary from close up, but together they can reshape the future of a place. The buried settlement beneath the desert may therefore be understood as more than a cluster of rooms. It was once a living exchange between human bodies and a feeding landscape. People stayed because the exchange worked well enough. They returned because the land, the group, and the stored future remained connected. If that connection slowly weakened, the walls themselves could not feed anyone. The settlement might still stand, but the reason to remain could begin to thin, meal by meal, season by season, until the oldest human answer became reasonable again, to seek life somewhere else. Stored food changes the feeling of a place. It allows a community to imagine a future that does not depend completely on what can be found before sunset. Grain, dried plants, preserved meat, nuts, seeds, or other resources can become a kind of quiet protection against uncertainty. They make staying more possible because they turn the settlement into a container of time. A room, a bin, a basket, or a pit can hold the labor of past days and carry it forward. This is one of the reasons early settled life became so powerful. People could gather effort into one location. They could build not only walls but reserves. They could face a difficult season with something already saved. Yet the same system that protects people also binds them more tightly to the conditions that refill it. Storage is not magic. It depends on land, weather, plants, animals, labor, containers, dryness, protection from pests, and the trust that what is saved today will still be usable later. If any of these pieces weakens, storage can turn from comfort into anxiety. A stored food system asks many quiet questions. Will the next season produce enough? Will water arrive in time? Will the soil remain useful? Will animals stay near enough? Or will herds move beyond reach? Will insects enter the stored grain? Will rodents find the hidden supply? Will dampness, heat, or mold spoil what has been saved? Will people agree on how food is shared when there is less than expected? These questions may not appear in the ground as clearly as a wall or a stone tool, but they shape the life of every settlement. A community that depends more on storage begins to live with the future inside its houses. The future becomes something that must be guarded, measured, divided, and renewed. This was a deep change in the human story. For a very long time, people survived by knowing how to move through changing landscapes. They still planned, remembered, and prepared, but their security often came from flexible knowledge of many places. Early settlement shifted part of that security into one place. Food was no longer only out there in the landscape. It was also inside the settlement, in spaces that had to be defended from decay and from need itself. This made life more stable in some ways, but more vulnerable in others. If a group lives by returning to the same rooms and relying on stored supplies, then a bad year does not vanish when the year ends. It can enter the next season through smaller reserves, weaker bodies, and greater pressure on work. If several difficult years come close together, the problem may grow quietly. People might eat seed that would otherwise be planted. They might spend more time gathering wild foods farther away. They might reduce sharing, change meals, delay repairs, or send some members elsewhere. None of this has to look like collapse. It may look like adaptation, but adaptation has a cost when it must be repeated too often. A settlement can survive scarcity for a time, just as a body can survive hunger for a time. The question is how long the system can recover before the next pressure arrives. Food also ties people to one another in new ways. A stored supply can support cooperation, but it can also create tension. Who filled it? Who guards it? Who has the right to use it? Who receives more when there is not enough? We cannot claim to know the rules of a settlement whose voices are gone, and we should not place modern motives inside ancient people. But we can understand that food stored in one place changes social life. It creates shared dependence. It requires trust. It makes generosity important, but also makes conflict possible. Near the origin of settled communities, these pressures would have been part of the new experiment of remaining. A household was no longer only a group of bodies moving through the world. It was a group tied to spaces, tools, stores, neighbours, and repeated obligations. The settlement itself became a food machine, but a delicate one. The fields, wild stands, herds, hunting grounds, water sources, storage rooms, hearths, grinding stones, fuel paths, and hands of workers all had to connect. If the connection held, the place could feel secure enough to last beyond a single generation. If the connection weakened, the walls could remain while confidence faded. This is why the abandoned place beneath dry earth should not be imagined only through the drama of disappearance. It should be imagined through the daily arithmetic of food and effort. A longer walk for fuel means more time spent away from other tasks. Harder processing means more strain on hands, backs, and shoulders. Smaller stores mean more careful meals. Less reliable water means more risk for plants, animals, cleaning and cooking. More mouths mean a greater need for the next season to succeed. Every part touches another part. The settlement is strong only when the whole exchange between people and landscape remains within reach. Once that exchange becomes too strained, leaving may no longer be a strange choice. It may become the most human choice of all, older than storage, older than walls, older than the dream of staying forever. If food was the hidden engine of the settlement, then any change in that engine would have reached every wall, every hearth, and every sleeping place. A community can endure one difficult season. It can tighten its habits, stretch its stores, walk farther, eat differently, repair less, share more carefully, or depend on relatives beyond the settlement. Human beings had survived uncertainty for a very long time before they ever built permanent rooms. The older human answer to trouble was not panic, it was adjustment. But a settled food system changes the scale of adjustment. When people build their lives around repeated return, they do not only respond to the land day by day, they also create expectations about what the land will provide across seasons and generations. A storage place expects refilling. A field, if there was cultivation, expects enough water and labour. A managed herd, if animals were part of the system, expects grazing, protection, reproduction, and health. A gathering route expects useful plants to remain within reach. A hunting ground expects animals to keep moving through a known world. A household expects that work done now will make later life possible. The question is, what happens when these expectations begin to fail slowly? Not all at once, not clearly enough for us to name a single moment, just slowly enough that the old pattern becomes harder to trust. If the system that feeds a settlement changes, people have choices, but none of them are weightless. They can repair the system by working harder. They can change the way they use the landscape. They can shift their diet. They can rely more on stored food, more on wild foods, more on animals, more on exchange, or more on seasonal movement. They can send some people away and keep others near the old houses. They can use the settlement differently, perhaps less permanently than before. They can return to it at certain times and leave it empty at others. They can hold on because the walls, the dead, the memories, and the familiar ground still matter. Or, over time, they can let the place lose its centre. Archaeology may later call this abandonment, but for the people living through it, the process may have felt more like a series of practical decisions. The old settlement may not have been rejected in one dramatic gesture. It may have been used less, repaired less, depended on less, until life gathered more strongly somewhere else. This is why a change in food can be so important and so difficult to prove. Food touches everything, but it often leaves only indirect signs. Burnt seeds, grinding stones, animal bones, storage spaces, tools, residue, pollen, soil evidence, and waste deposits can suggest how people ate and worked. They can show change over time, but they rarely tell us the exact pressure that made a household decide not to rebuild, or a younger generation decide to move. We can see the remains of meals more easily than the weakening of confidence. Near the beginning of settled life, that confidence was still a fragile human invention. People were learning to believe that one place could hold tomorrow. They were learning to make time visible in stored food, repaired walls, and repeated labor. But the deeper history of the human body remained older than the settlement. The body could still walk away. The group could still reorganize. The memory of movement had not disappeared just because walls had risen. So if the feeding system began to strain, leaving would not necessarily mean collapse in the modern dramatic sense. It could mean that people were returning to an older form of wisdom. Life must follow the conditions that support it. A place is important, but it is not more important than water, food, health, and the possibility of raising the next generation. The buried settlement beneath the dry land becomes haunting because it preserves one side of the decision and hides the other. We see the fixed side: walls, rooms, hearths, surfaces, objects, the architecture of staying. We do not see clearly the moving side, the paths taken away, the families who settled elsewhere, the knowledge carried in memory, the seeds or animals or tools that may have gone with them, the quiet transfer of life from one center to another. The desert makes the place look like an ending, but for the people who left, it may also have been a continuation. They may have abandoned the walls, but not the skills that built them. They may have left the rooms, but not the habits of cooperation, storage, cooking, repair, and care. The settlement's food system may have weakened, changed, or been replaced, but the human story did not stop at the edge of the ruins. That is the most careful way to hold the mystery. If the system that once fed the place changed, people may have tried to fix it, adapt to it, and finally move beyond it. What we cannot know with certainty is where the balance tipped, and when the old ground stopped feeling like the safest answer. The mind often wants abandonment to arrive with a sound, a wall falling, a fire spreading, a line of people fleeing, a sudden drought cracking the ground, a violent arrival from outside. These images are powerful because they give the past a shape we can understand quickly, but many human places do not end that way. Some places disappear more quietly. They thin out. They lose repairs. They lose children's footsteps. They lose the daily pressure of hands on tools, smoke in hearths, and voices near walls. A settlement can become empty without being destroyed in one visible moment. This is especially important when looking at a very early human community, because the absence of people does not automatically prove catastrophe. It proves only that the pattern of living there did not continue in the same way. That difference matters. A place can be left because it is ruined, but it can also be left because another place becomes more useful, because old routes change, because water becomes harder, because food systems shift, because social ties move outward, because younger generations form their future elsewhere, or because the settlement slowly stops giving back enough for the effort it requires. None of these possibilities needs a dramatic scar in the soil. Some of the deepest changes in human life leave only faint material traces. The final use of a room, the last layer of ash, a floor not renewed, a wall allowed to crumble, an object left where it was no longer worth carrying. From far away, these signs can feel like an ending. From inside the life of the people who made them, they may have felt like ordinary decisions. Stay for the season, but not the whole year. Repair one house, but not another. Keep some food here, but more food elsewhere. Return to old ground for a while, then return less often. Over time, a settlement can move from being the center of life to being one place among several, and then a memory. This is why we should be careful with stories of collapse. Collapse sounds final. It suggests a single downward motion. But early settled life was not a tower that either stood or fell. It was a living arrangement between people, land, food, water, health, labor, memory, and cooperation. If that arrangement changed, people could respond in many ways. They might reduce the number of households staying there. They might divide the year differently. They might strengthen ties with other groups. They might shift work toward another valley, another water source, another field, another herd, another route. They might carry tools, seeds, animals, practices, and stories away from the old settlement while leaving the heavy walls behind. In that case, what looks to us like abandonment may have been reorganization. The walls stopped being used, but life continued beyond them. Near the beginning of settled human history, this would not be strange. The older human past was full of movement. People had long known that survival sometimes required leaving familiar ground. Settlement added a new attachment to place, but it did not erase the older ability to move when conditions demanded it. A community could love a place, depend on a place, bury its dead near a place, and still eventually move away from it. Attachment and departure are not opposites in human history. Often they exist together. The same people who build carefully may also know when the effort of remaining has become too heavy. This makes the abandoned settlement beneath dry earth more interesting than a simple disaster story. If there is no clear sign of sudden destruction, the quietness itself becomes meaningful. It suggests that the end may have been gradual, practical, and divided across many lives. Some may have stayed longer than others. Some may have returned after others had gone. Some rooms may have remained active while others filled with dust. The settlement may have faded unevenly, like a path used less each year until the ground no longer remembers the feet clearly. A catastrophic story gives us a quick answer, but a slower story may be closer to how many human places actually change. The desert, when it covers the remains, makes everything seem frozen. It turns a long process into a still image, but beneath that stillness may be generations of adjustment, hesitation, repair, and release. The place was not necessarily struck down. It may have simply stopped being the best answer to the question every human community must ask again and again. Where can life continue with enough water, food, safety, work, memory, and hope? A settlement can begin to disappear while people are still living in it. That is difficult to imagine because we often think of abandonment as a clean line. A place is occupied, then it is empty. A hearth burns, then it goes cold. But human places often pass through a long middle state, where the old pattern remains visible, yet no longer holds life with the same strength. A house may still be used, but less often. A wall may still stand, but no one repairs it with the same care. A storage place may still exist, but the food inside it may come from somewhere else, or only serve shorter visits. The settlement is not gone, but its centre has begun to weaken. Archaeology can sometimes see this kind of change in indirect ways. It may find fewer repairs, rooms used differently, debris gathering where clean surfaces once mattered, or buildings left to collapse instead of being renewed. But the ground cannot easily preserve hesitation. It cannot show the moment when one household began to think of another place as safer, easier, or more promising. In deep prehistory, before written records, abandonment may not have been a single event at all. It may have been a pattern spread across generations. One generation may have known the settlement as the main place of life. The next may have divided its time between that place and another. A later generation may have known the old walls as a place connected to memory, ancestors, or seasonal return, but no longer as the centre of daily survival. By the time the settlement became empty in the archaeological record, the human decision may already have been old. The end may have begun long before the last fire was lit. Such a slow fading could happen through ordinary pressures. If water became less dependable, people might first walk farther rather than leave. If useful plants became thinner nearby, they might widen their range. If fuel became harder to find, they might use less, gather from farther away, or change how fire was managed. If food became harder to store or produce, they might rely more on relatives, exchange, wild resources, animals, or seasonal movement. If crowding brought more strain, some households might spend more time near other kin groups. If illness, hunger, or fatigue made repair harder, walls and roofs might be renewed later, then less carefully, then not at all. No single change has to end a settlement. The danger lies in accumulation. A place survives through repetition, and it weakens when repetition becomes too costly. Sweeping, carrying, grinding, storing, cooking, fetching water, repairing walls and returning after work all continue, but each task asks a little more from the body and the group. Near the beginning of settled life, this touched an older human tension between staying and moving. Human beings had survived for immense stretches of time by following changing conditions. Settlement gave people continuity, storage, familiar walls, and shared memory, but it did not erase the older skill of leaving. A family could leave a house and still carry tools, food knowledge, stories, relationships, seeds, animals, or techniques elsewhere. A room could go silent, while human life continued beyond it. This is why abandonment should not always be treated as the disappearance of a people. Sometimes it is the disappearance of one arrangement. The desert later makes the ending look absolute, because it preserves the fixed things: walls, floors, pits, collapsed roofs, and objects left behind. It cannot easily preserve the moving things: the path taken away, the new home chosen, the marriage tie, the changed route, the child who grew up belonging somewhere else. The silence of the settlement may not be the silence of one final day. It may be the silence of many ordinary days, slowly pulling life away from the walls. A place can vanish without being broken. That may be the coldest idea in the story, because it removes the comfort of a clear enemy. If a settlement is burned, conquered, flooded, or buried by a sudden disaster, the mind can point toward a single force and say, "There, that is what ended it." But if a place fades because fewer people return, fewer walls are repaired, fewer fires are lit, and fewer children learn its paths as the center of home, then the ending becomes harder to hold. It becomes a process rather than a scene. It becomes absence increasing by degrees. The old settlement may still stand under the same sky. Its rooms may still be known. Its walls may still cast shadows. Yet the human rhythm inside it grows thinner, season by season, until the place is more memory than shelter. This kind of disappearance leaves a different trace in the ground. There may be no thick destruction layer, no clear sign of panic, no evidence that everyone fled at once. Instead, the remains may show change in use, slower repair, less careful maintenance, or spaces that quietly filled with debris. These are modest signs, but they can speak of a profound shift. A settlement is held together by repetition. People return, clean, rebuild, cook, store, bury, teach, and begin again. When those repetitions weaken, the settlement weakens with them. Nothing dramatic has to happen for the center to move elsewhere. A few households may spend more time near another water source. A few young adults may join relatives in another place. A few rooms may be used only during certain seasons. A few repairs may be delayed because other work matters more. Each choice may be practical and small. Together, they can change the fate of a place. Near the beginning of settled human life, this slow fading would have been especially meaningful. People were still close to a much older inheritance of movement. The knowledge of how to leave was not a failure stored in the back of the mind. It was part of being human. For countless generations, human groups had survived by reading change and responding before danger became absolute. Settlement gave people new reasons to stay: walls, stored food, familiar ground, social bonds, perhaps the presence of the dead, and the comfort of known routines. But those reasons had to remain stronger than the reasons to go. If water became less reliable, if food required too much labor, if fuel grew distant, if sickness or crowding added strain, if another place offered a better balance, then staying could slowly lose its authority. This does not mean the people disappeared. It means the old arrangement no longer carried life as it once had. A settlement can die as a center, while its people continue elsewhere. Skills can travel. Stories can travel. Seeds, tools, animals, ornaments, habits of cooking, ways of building, and memories of older walls can all move with human bodies. The desert preserves what could not move, and that is why it can mislead the imagination. We see the fixed remains and think of an ending. But the moving life has gone beyond the frame. The abandoned rooms may not mark a final collapse. They may mark a transfer, a rebalancing, a quiet decision made many times by many people until no one needed the old place enough to keep it alive. That is why the silence beneath the dry earth feels so deep. It is not only the silence after disaster. It may be the silence after usefulness has drained away. No scream, no final announcement, no single day when the settlement became past. Only a gradual lessening, until the walls remained and the human pattern did not. A settlement is never made only of houses. It is made of people at different points in a human life. Infants who cannot walk, children who learn by watching, young adults who carry water, gather fuel, shape tools, prepare food, build walls, repair roofs, and form new bonds. Older adults who hold memory, skill, and knowledge of seasons. The sick, the injured, the pregnant, the grieving, and the dead all belong to the same human arrangement. When we imagine an early settlement beneath dry earth, we should not picture only empty rooms and ancient walls. We should picture a community stretched across generations, with each age of life placing a different demand on the place. This matters because population is not just a number, it is a pattern of needs. A few more children mean more care before they can help with heavy work. More adults mean more labour, but also more food required every day. More older people may mean more memory and skill, but also more bodies that need support during difficult seasons. Births, deaths, illness, accidents, marriages and departures all change the balance of a settlement slowly. The ground may preserve walls better than family structure, but every wall once stood inside this living human rhythm. In some early settled communities, the dead were not always far away from the living. In certain Neolithic traditions, burials could occur within or near domestic spaces, though practices varied greatly by place and time. This should be handled carefully, not as a rule for every settlement, but as a reminder that early settled life could bind people to place through more than shelter. A house could hold memory, a floor could cover earlier lives, a room could belong not only to the living moment, but to a chain of generations. If people buried their dead nearby, returned to the same structures, or rebuilt over older layers, then leaving the settlement may have carried a different weight. It was not only a practical matter of finding more food or better water, it could also mean loosening a bond with the remembered dead, with family history, and with the ground where earlier lives had been placed. Yet the same generational depth that makes a settlement meaningful can also make it heavy. A larger community needs a stronger food system. It needs more water, more fuel, more space, more cooperation, more conflict management, and more ways to care for those who cannot fully care for themselves. If the number of people grows while the surrounding landscape becomes less generous, the pressure does not fall evenly. It reaches the body through hunger, work, and worry, but it also reaches the social world through decisions about sharing, movement, marriage, care, and responsibility. Near the beginning of settled human life, this was a new form of pressure. Older mobile groups also had children, elders, sickness, and death, but movement gave them a different relationship with space. A settled community had to fit many stages of life into a smaller, more repeated world. The child learned the same paths. The adult repaired the same walls. The old person remembered earlier versions of the same place. The dead, where they remained close, deepened the sense that the settlement was more than a shelter. It was a human container of time. That container could be strong, but it could also become difficult to carry. If fewer young people stayed, repair could slow. If more mouths depended on uncertain food, storage could strain. If sickness reduced labour, water, fuel, and maintenance could become harder. If marriages or kin ties pulled households elsewhere, the settlement's future could begin to move away before its walls fell. This is why population and generations matter to the mystery of abandonment. A place may be left not only because land changes, but because the human balance inside the place changes too. The ruins show architecture, but beneath that architecture was once a living arrangement of ages, needs, memories, and obligations. When that arrangement no longer held, the walls could remain while the generations moved on. When more people gather in one place, the settlement gains strength before it gains strain. More hands can carry water, shape walls, gather fuel, process food, watch children, care for the sick, and defend stored resources. More minds can remember where animals move, which plants ripen first, where stone can be found, and how the seasons have behaved in earlier years. A larger community can hold more skill than a small household alone. It can divide labour. It can protect knowledge from being lost when one person dies. It can make the place feel less fragile, because no single body carries the whole burden. This is one reason early settled life could become so powerful. It allowed human beings to gather not only in space, but in memory. Yet the same gathering also changed the pressure on the land. Every additional person needed food. Every child needed care before becoming a worker. Every hearth needed fuel. Everybody needed water. Every sleeping space, storage place, refuse area, and working surface became part of a denser human world. If the surrounding landscape remained generous enough, population could support the settlement. If the landscape became less reliable, the same population could become a weight the place struggled to carry. This is the quiet tension inside growth. Success can create the conditions for later difficulty. A settlement that attracts people, holds families, and supports children may slowly require more from its environment than the environment can easily provide. The change may be almost invisible at first. A path to fuel becomes longer. A water source becomes more crowded. Food stores empty sooner. Hunting or gathering requires wider movement. More time is spent processing harder foods. More effort is needed to keep rooms clean, repaired, and usable. None of these signs has to mean the end. They may simply be part of life. But when they accumulate across years, the settlement begins to ask more from each person. The body feels population pressure before it becomes an archaeological pattern. It feels it as longer work, shorter rest, heavier carrying, thinner meals, more care duties, and less room for mistake. Near the beginning of settled human life, this would have been especially important because people were learning how much human closeness a place could hold. Living together created cooperation, but it also required rules, habits, trust, and restraint. Stored food had to be shared or protected. Water had to be accessed. Waste had to be managed. Children had to be watched. The sick had to be cared for. Conflicts had to be softened before they tore households apart. We cannot know the exact social arrangements of a silent prehistoric settlement, and we should not invent them, but we can understand that a denser community was never only a collection of houses. It was a living network of obligations. If that network remained strong, the place could endure pressure. If the network weakened, the same pressure could become harder to absorb. Population also moves through time. It is not fixed. A few families leaving may matter more than their number suggests if they take skills, marriage ties, labour, or knowledge with them. A few fewer births may make the future feel different. A few more dependents during a harsh period may strain food and care. A settlement can look stable from the outside while its generational balance is changing inside. This is why abandonment may begin long before emptiness. The walls may still stand, but the future may already be shifting elsewhere. If younger people spend more time in other places, if food requires too much work, if water and fuel become harder, if care becomes heavier, then the old centre weakens. The mystery of a buried settlement is therefore not only what happened to the buildings, it is what happened to the balance between the number of people, the needs of their bodies, and the land that had to support them. A successful settlement can create its own burden. That idea feels strange at first, because success usually sounds like safety. If more people are born, if more houses are repaired, if more food is stored, if more generations remain near the same ground, then the place appears to be working. It has not failed. It has held life long enough for memory to deepen. But in early settled communities, success could also tighten the bond between people and a limited landscape. More families meant more mouths. More stored food meant more dependence on future supply. More houses meant more maintenance. More children meant more care before they could contribute fully to heavy work. More elders meant more remembered knowledge, but also more need for support when seasons became difficult. The settlement grew stronger through human closeness, yet that closeness made the whole arrangement more demanding. This is not a contradiction. It is one of the basic tensions of staying. A place that supports a small community may struggle when the community grows. A water source that is enough for a few households may become strained when many return to it every day. Nearby fuel that once seemed plentiful may become scarce after years of cutting, gathering, burning, and rebuilding. Wild foods may become harder to find close to the settlement. Fields, gardens, or managed plants where they existed may require more careful labour. Animals, if they were part of the food system, may need grazing, watching, protection, and water. Every success creates another layer of need. The settlement becomes not only a shelter, but a machine of daily demands. If the machine continues to receive enough from the land, it can endure. If the land begins to answer less reliably, the same human success can become heavy. This does not mean people were trapped by their own growth in a simple way. Human groups are adaptable. They can change routes, change foods, change work, change social ties, change where they spend seasons, and change how they cooperate. But adaptation also requires energy. When many people depend on one place, every adjustment must pass through more bodies and more obligations. A decision about food is also a decision about children, elders, workers, the sick, and the future. A decision about water is also a decision about distance, labour, cleanliness, cooking, and survival. A decision about leaving is also a decision about memory, burial, kinship, and the meaning of home. Near the beginning of settled life, people were learning how powerful and how fragile this kind of human density could be. Their older history had taught movement. Their newer world taught return. For a time, return may have been the better answer. The settlement began security, cooperation, storage, and shared memory. But if the community became too large for the land, or if the land became less able to support the community, the balance could shift quietly. The place that once gathered strength could begin to gather strain. More people would not automatically mean collapse. It might simply mean more negotiation, more careful sharing, more work, and more reasons for some households to look outward. A few families might move closer to another resource. Younger adults might form bonds elsewhere. Seasonal movement might increase. Repair might slow in the older rooms. The settlement would not need to be rejected. It could simply become less central. This is why population matters to the mystery of abandonment. A place can fail because it was weak, but it can also weaken because it once succeeded. It held people, and holding people changed the pressures around it. The buried walls beneath dry earth may therefore preserve not only evidence of settlement, but evidence of a question every human community still faces. How much life can one place carry before the reasons to stay begin to thin? Dry earth has a strange power over human memory. In some places it can preserve what water would have softened, scattered, or carried away. A wall made from earth may keep its outline. A hearth may remain as a dark stain. A floor may lie hidden under later dust. Seeds, bones, ash, tools, and fragments of daily work may survive long enough for another age to find them. The desert can become a kind of archive, not because it explains the past, but because it slows the disappearance of certain things. It keeps shapes, it keeps edges, it keeps the material afterlife of human effort. Yet this same dryness can also create a false sense of clarity. When a buried settlement is uncovered, the walls may seem to offer a direct path back to the people who lived there. The rooms appear, the hearths appear, the objects appear, but the meaning of those things remains much harder to recover. The desert can preserve evidence while erasing the living world that made the evidence meaningful. It can keep a storage pit, but not the worry or confidence that filled it. It can keep a floor, but not the ordinary voices that crossed it. It can keep a burial, but not the full memory held by the people who placed the dead there. It can keep the shape of a settlement while removing the reasons that once moved through it. This is one reason an ancient place beneath dry land feels so powerful. It seems close and distant at the same time. The hand of a builder may be visible in the wall, but the builder's name is gone. The remains of food may survive, but the meal itself has disappeared. The signs of staying are visible, but the final change into leaving is still hidden. Archaeology works inside this tension. It studies what remains, but it must also respect what has been lost. A dry environment may protect some materials better than other environments, but preservation is never complete. Organic materials may still decay. Wind can disturb surfaces. Later, people or animals can move objects. Erosion can remove layers. Time can break connections between things that once belonged together. Even when a site is remarkably preserved, it is not a whole world waiting untouched underground. It is a damaged memory, partly saved and partly erased. Near the beginning of settled human life, this matters deeply because the meaning of a place was carried largely in practice, not writing. People did not leave behind a written explanation for every wall, tool, room, or departure. Their world was known through use. A path mattered because feet returned to it. A hearth mattered because bodies gathered near it. A room mattered because daily work gave it purpose. When those uses ended, the objects remained, but their full social meaning began to fade. The desert, then, is both guardian and thief. It guards the outline of the settlement, but steals the movement that once made it alive. It guards the physical traces, but steals the conversations, decisions, fears, habits, and small adjustments that might explain why people finally stopped renewing the place. That is why the silence of the abandoned settlement should not be mistaken for emptiness. It is filled with preserved fragments, but also with missing connections. We can see that people built, cooked, stored, repaired, and returned. We can see that the place once held a pattern of life. But when we ask why that pattern ended, the desert gives us only part of the answer. It shows us what could remain after thousands of years. It also reminds us how much of human life was never made to survive that long. A buried settlement gives two kinds of truth at the same time. One truth is physical. A wall is there, a floor is there, a hearth is there, a tool rests in a layer of soil, a seed has survived by accident, a bone carries a mark from an ancient blade. These things are not imaginary. They are the solid remains of human action. They allow careful study. They can be measured, compared, dated, mapped, and placed within a wider pattern of early settled life. But the second truth is more difficult. Physical evidence does not automatically carry its own explanation. A wall proves that people built, but not the full reason they chose that exact place. A hearth proves that fire was used, but not every meal, every gathering, or every fear that may have surrounded it. A storage space shows planning, but not whether the people who filled it felt secure or uncertain. An abandoned room shows that use ended, but not whether the ending came through choice, pressure, necessity, or a mixture of all three. This difference between evidence and interpretation is one of the most important boundaries in any honest story about the deep past. The evidence anchors us. Interpretation helps us think. But interpretation must not pretend to be more certain than the ground allows. In a later city with writing, a tablet or inscription might name a ruler, record a shortage, mention a conflict, mark a boundary, or preserve a prayer. In a settlement from deep prehistory, the record is mostly material. It shows what people did with earth, fire, food, tools, bodies, and space. It does not give a direct voice explaining what those actions meant. Archaeologists can compare patterns. How rooms were arranged, how long floors were renewed, how food remains changed, how animal bones were treated, how tools were made, how refuse gathered, how buildings were repaired or left alone. These patterns can suggest possibilities. They can show continuity, change, stress, adaptation, or reorganization. But they do not always reduce the past to one answer. Near the beginning of settled human life, this is especially important because people were creating new ways of living before written memory could preserve their own explanation. Their bodies recorded life through action. Hands shaped clay, feet wore surfaces, smoke marked walls, teeth wore down through food. Bones, seeds, ash, and stone entered the ground as fragments of routine. A settlement became readable because life had been repeated there. Yet repetition does not reveal motive in a simple way. A repaired wall may suggest attachment, need, skill, or habit. A room left unused may suggest departure, change of function, seasonal use, or decline. A shift in food remains may suggest environmental change, altered preference, different access, or new relationships with other groups. The same trace can support more than one careful possibility. That does not make the study meaningless. It makes it human. Human life is rarely caused by one thing alone. Water, food, climate, health, population, social ties, memory, and labor all touch one another. When a settlement is abandoned, the ending may come from the way many pressures overlap rather than from one dramatic cause. The dry earth may preserve the outline of the place so clearly that it feels as if the answer should be nearby. But clarity of shape is not the same as clarity of meaning. A room can be visible while its final use remains uncertain. A path can be traced while the destination is lost. A hearth can be dated while the reason it went cold is still beyond reach. This is why the phrase "nobody knows" should not be understood as ignorance or laziness. It can also mean discipline. It means the evidence has not given a single final cause, and the most truthful response is to hold several possibilities without forcing one to become a false certainty. The settlement beneath the desert teaches that the past is not silent because it has nothing left to say. It is silent because it speaks through remains, and remains must be listened to slowly. The phrase, "nobody knows why," can sound like a failure, but in deep prehistory, it is often a form of honesty. It does not mean there is no evidence. It means the evidence has not narrowed the story to one certain cause. A buried settlement may show that people lived there, returned there, worked there, and changed the ground through years of repeated use. It may show a long pattern of occupation, then a shift, then silence. But silence at the end of a site is not the same as a clear answer. The last layer of use may suggest that life became different, yet it may not tell whether the people left because water became harder to reach, food became less reliable, social ties moved elsewhere, disease added pressure, population changed, or several of these pressures slowly touched one another. This is why the mystery should not be treated as an empty dramatic phrase. It is a real limit in what can be known from the remains. The ground preserves actions better than reasons. It can keep ash from a fire, but not the decision not to light it again. It can keep a wall, but not the discussion that may have happened before the wall was left unrepaired. It can keep bones, seeds, tools and flaws, but not the full chain of thought behind departure. In a world before writing, the most important explanations may have lived only in memory, speech, habit, and shared understanding. Once the people moved on, those explanations moved with them or disappeared with them. The place left behind became evidence without testimony. This makes the abandoned settlement more, not less, meaningful. It asks us to respect the difference between a possible explanation and a proven one. A drier climate may be part of the story, especially if the surrounding landscape changed over time. But climate alone should not be forced into the whole answer. Food pressure may be part of the story, especially if the settlement depended on storage, repeated harvests, managed animals, or reliable gathering grounds. But food alone may not explain every room going silent. Disease, crowding, waste, smoke, and water could have shaped daily life, but they do not automatically become the final cause. Population growth may have created strain, but growth can also create strength, skill, protection, and cooperation. Social reorganization may have pulled people elsewhere, but movement is not the same as disappearance. Every possibility opens a door, and none should be made into a locked room too quickly. Near the beginning of settled life, human communities were still learning how to bind themselves to one ground without losing the older ability to respond to change. The settlement beneath dry earth stands at that threshold. It shows the human wish to remain and the human need to adapt. It shows walls that once made life more stable, an absence that reminds us stability can end. The truth may be that abandonment did not have one reason in the way a modern headline wants one reason. It may have been a slow crossing of a hidden line. Before that line, repair still made sense. Storage still made sense. Return still made sense. After that line, another place, another route, another arrangement of life may have seemed more workable. No one needed to name the moment for it to become real. The settlement could fade through small decisions until the old center no longer held. That is why nobody knows is not a weakness in the story. It is the point where the story becomes most truthful. The ancient place does not give us a final confession. It gives us a careful warning. Human worlds can be built with great patience, and still their deepest reasons can vanish before the walls do. The abandoned settlement beneath dry earth is not alone in the larger human story. Across many regions and many periods, people have built places, lived in them, changed them, and then left them behind. Some were small, some were large. Some lasted briefly. Others gathered layer after layer of human use before they faded. This does not make every abandoned place the same, and it does not mean one explanation can be placed over all of them. A village left near a river, a settlement moved from a dry plain, a hilltop community reduced over time, or a later city losing population all belong to different worlds. But they share one quiet truth. Human places are never permanent simply because people want them to be. They depend on living systems around them. Water must remain reachable, food must remain possible, labor must remain bearable, social ties must remain strong enough. The next generation must still see a reason to stay. When those conditions shift, the built place may remain while life moves elsewhere. This has happened many times, in many forms, long after the first experiments in settled life began. Some settlements were damaged by conflict, fire, earthquake, flood, drought, or political change. Others were not destroyed so clearly. They were reduced, reorganized, moved, or absorbed into new patterns of living. A place might lose its central role but still be visited. It might become seasonal. It might be remembered rather than inhabited. It might be reused later by different people who did not know the full story of those who came before. The ground, from a distance, may make these changes look final, but human movement is rarely so neat. The end of one place can be the beginning of another arrangement. This is important because the mind often treats abandonment as failure. Empty rooms look like loss. Silent walls look like defeat. But in the deeper history of our species, leaving was also a form of intelligence. Long before people built fixed settlements, human survival depended on reading change and responding to it. Movement was not disorder. It was knowledge in action. Even after people began to live in more permanent places, that older inheritance did not disappear. A community could remain for generations and still carry the ability to shift when the balance of life changed. The abandoned settlement beneath the desert belongs to this wider pattern. Its silence may feel mysterious because it is so old and because no written voice explains the last stage of life there. But the act of leaving a place is not strange in human history. What is strange is our modern expectation that a built place should continue simply because it has walls. Early people may have understood something more direct. A place matters only while it can hold life. When it no longer holds life well enough, the future may have to move. Other abandoned places remind us to be careful with drama. Not every empty settlement is a dead civilization. Not every ruin is evidence of sudden disaster. Not every departure means the people vanished. Sometimes people moved a short distance. Sometimes they joined relatives. Sometimes they followed water, animals, fields, trade, marriage, or safer ground. Sometimes they carried their skills so completely that the old walls became less important than the knowledge taken away. Near the beginning of settled life, this may have been especially true. The people who left an early settlement may not have seen themselves as ending a world. They may have been continuing life by changing its location. The walls stayed behind because walls are heavy. Human memory, tools, habits, and relationships could travel. That is why the buried place should be seen not only as a mystery of disappearance, but as one example of a repeated human pattern. We build, we trust, we adapt, and sometimes we leave before the place can no longer answer us. Abandonment is a word that can mislead because it sounds like a door closing forever. It makes us imagine a place emptied, forgotten, and cut away from the lives that once filled it. But in archaeology, an abandoned settlement does not always mean the end of a people. It may mean that one location stopped serving as the center of life. The families, skills, memories, tools, animals, seeds, and habits connected to that place may have continued elsewhere. A wall can be abandoned because a wall cannot move. A person can move and carry much of a world within the body. This difference is essential when thinking about a settlement buried beneath dry earth. The silence of the rooms does not prove that the community vanished in a single moment. It may show that people reorganized the pattern of living, shifting toward other places, other routes, or other forms of settlement. The old center became less necessary, while life itself continued beyond the edges of what the desert preserved. This is why the question should be held carefully. When archaeologists speak of abandonment, they may be describing a change in the use of space. A house is no longer repaired. A courtyard no longer receives daily work. A hearth is no longer renewed. A storage pit fills with debris. These are real signs, but they do not automatically tell us what happened to the people. They may have moved nearby. They may have spread across several smaller places. They may have joined kin in another settlement. They may have changed from year-round occupation to seasonal use before leaving completely. They may have carried old practices into a new landscape where the evidence is harder to connect. From the viewpoint of the buried walls, this looks like absence. From the viewpoint of human survival, it may have been adaptation. Near the beginning of settled life, this distinction matters even more, because human beings were still close to a long inheritance of movement. Staying in one place was a powerful experiment, but it was not the only possible answer. If water became less reliable, if food required too much effort, if population pressure grew, if social ties stretched toward other communities, or if younger generations found better possibilities elsewhere, then leaving did not have to mean defeat. It could mean that the old settlement had served its time. The people may have taken with them the knowledge that mattered most: how to build, how to store, how to cook, how to cooperate, how to remember, and how to begin again. The material remains can make this hard to see because archaeology often finds the things that were too heavy, broken, ordinary, or unnecessary to carry. Walls stay, floors stay, ash stays, lost tools stay, broken vessels stay, refuse stays. The moving life leaves fewer traces in the place it has left. This gives ruins their emotional power, but also their danger. They tempt us to mistake stillness for extinction. Yet human history is filled with movement after settlement, reorganization after pressure, and continuity after departure. A place can be abandoned while a tradition survives. A house can be empty while a family line continues. A settlement can become silent while its people help shape another one. The ancient site beneath the desert may therefore represent not a single ending, but a transfer of life away from one fixed point. The deepest mystery is not only why the walls were left, it is where the living pattern went after the walls stopped holding it. When people leave a settlement, they do not leave everything. The heaviest things remain behind: walls, floors, roof beams if they survive, storage pits, broken tools, ash, refuse, and the shape of rooms. These are the things archaeologists later find, and because they stay in place, they can make departure look like a clean break. But human life is not made only of heavy things. Much of it is light enough to travel. A person can carry a blade, a basket, a skin bag, a handful of seeds, a memory of where water once flowed, a method of building, a way of cooking, a song, a story, a warning, a skill learned from older hands. A family can leave the walls and still carry the knowledge that made the walls possible. This is why abandonment should not be imagined only as loss. It may also be movement, transfer, and continuation. A settlement beneath dry earth may appear silent now, but the people who left it may not have stepped into silence. They may have stepped into another human network, another valley, another water source, another season of life. We should be careful not to turn them into ghosts too quickly. The rooms became empty, but the living may have gone on. This matters because early settled communities were not isolated machines. They were connected to landscapes and probably to other people beyond the settlement itself. Even without written roads or maps, humans moved through remembered routes. They exchanged materials, ideas, partners, habits, and news in ways that may leave only faint traces. Stone could come from a distant source. Shells, pigments, tools, or styles might show contact across wider regions. Food practices could spread. Building methods could be learned and changed. A settlement was a center, but it was not the whole world. If that center weakened, people did not need to vanish. They could shift their lives into other parts of the wider human landscape. This is one of the oldest strengths of our species. Long before permanent houses, humans survived by carrying knowledge through changing conditions. Settlement added walls to that knowledge, but it did not remove the ability to move beyond them. The abandoned place therefore holds only one side of the story. It holds the side that could not travel. It holds the clay, the stone, the burnt earth, the layered floors, the traces of repeated use. It does not easily hold the side that walked away. It does not show where children grew up afterward, where tools were used again, where marriages formed, where food was gathered, where another roof was repaired, or where the memory of the old place settled inside a new one. The desert preserves the stillness, not the continuation. That is why an empty settlement can feel more tragic than it may have been. To us, The silence looks final because we are standing among what stayed behind. But to the people who left, the future may have been ahead of them, not buried behind them. They may have left because life required it, not because life had ended. Of course, this does not make abandonment painless or simple. Leaving a place of repeated living can carry real weight. A house may hold the memory of births, deaths, meals, repairs, and ordinary mornings. A path may hold the memory of feet that crossed it for years. A hearth may hold the memory of warmth shared through difficult seasons. If the dead were buried near the living, leaving could mean loosening a bond with ancestral ground. But humans have always lived between attachment and survival. A place can be loved and still become impossible to keep. The careful lesson is that the end of a settlement is not always the end of its people. The walls may fall silent, while the skills, relationships, and memories continue somewhere beyond the edge of the excavation. The deeper mystery may not be what destroyed the settlement. It may be what made people stop believing that the settlement was the right future. Destruction is easier to imagine because it comes from outside. A flood, a fire, a drought, an enemy, a disease, a broken food system. Each gives the mind something to point toward. But a human community does not live only by avoiding danger. It lives by judging, day after day, whether a place still answers enough needs to be worth the labor of staying. That judgment can change long before the walls fall. A house may still stand, yet feel less useful. A hearth may still burn, yet not as often. A storage space may still exist, yet no longer carry the same confidence. A path may still lead inward, yet more feet may begin to follow paths leading away. At some point, a settlement may stop being imagined as the center of tomorrow. That shift is harder to see than a disaster, but it may be closer to the truth of many abandoned places. People do not always leave because a place has become impossible in one clear moment. Sometimes they leave because another arrangement slowly becomes more reasonable. The old place asks for repair, water, fuel, food, cleaning, cooperation, care, and patience. A new place, or a wider pattern of movement, may ask less. The decision may not belong to one leader or one day. It may be spread through households, seasons, marriages, births, deaths, and small choices that never announce themselves as history. One family spends longer away, another stores more food elsewhere, a young adult forms ties outside the old settlement, a damaged wall waits too long for repair. A room that once held daily life becomes useful only for storage, then not even that. The settlement remains visible, but the future has begun to loosen from it. Near the beginning of settled life, this question of the future was still new. For most of the deeper human past, survival had depended on movement through changing worlds. People learned to read water, plants, animals, weather, distance, and risk. They carried knowledge in memory, bodies, and relationships. Settlement asked them to place more trust in one ground. It promised continuity, but it also demanded faith that tomorrow would still belong there. When that faith weakened, leaving may not have felt like betrayal. It may have felt like a return to an older wisdom. Life follows the conditions that can support it. This is why the real question is not only why the place was abandoned, but when the settlement stopped feeling like an answer. Was it when water became harder? When food required too much labor? When the young saw more possibility elsewhere? When illness, smoke, waste, crowding, or fatigue made daily life heavier? When the dead tied people to the ground, but the living needed to move beyond it? We cannot know this with certainty. The evidence may show changes in rooms, floors, hearths, refuse, tools, and food remains, but it cannot preserve the exact moment when confidence began to fade. Yet that unseen moment matters. A place is kept alive not only by walls, but by the belief that repairing the walls is still worth doing. Once that belief thins, abandonment has already begun, even if people are still present. The desert later covers the result and makes it look like an ending. But the deeper mystery lies before the silence, in the slow human calculation between memory and survival, between the weight of staying and the pull of a different future. A settlement can stop being the future for many reasons, and the most careful answer is to let those reasons remain multiple. The land may have changed. If rainfall became less dependable, water would not disappear as an idea. It would become a longer walk, a heavier container, a more anxious task repeated through the body. If soil became less productive, or useful plants grew thinner nearby, food would not vanish in one dramatic moment. It would become harder work, smaller stores, and more time spent searching beyond familiar ground. If animals moved differently, hunting, herding, or gathering around animal resources could become less predictable. If fuel became scarce close to the settlement, every fire would carry a greater cost. These are environmental pressures, but they do not remain outside human life. They enter the hands, lungs, backs, legs, stomachs, and sleep of the people who remain. Another possibility is that the food system itself became strained. A community that stores food must also refill, protect, divide, and preserve it. Stored grain or other resources can give confidence, but they can also attract pests, spoil in poor conditions, or create tension when there is not enough. If more people depended on the same stores, the question of sharing would become sharper. If fewer people were available for heavy work, the same tasks would weigh more on those who stayed. We cannot know the rules by which food was shared in a settlement without written explanation, but we can understand that food is never only food. It is labor, trust, timing, memory, and the body's most basic claim on tomorrow. Health may also have mattered, not as one certain plague, but as part of the background pressure of settled life. Close houses, repeated use of the same spaces, smoke from fires, waste, water, insects, rodents, and contact with animals could all shape the conditions in which bodies lived. A cough, an infected wound, a season of weakness, or repeated exposure to smoke may not leave a clear message in the soil. Yet health affects work. Work affects repair. Repair affects shelter. Shelter affects the ability to remain. In a small settlement, a few weakened households could change much more than their number suggests. Social ties may have shifted as well. A place is held together by relationships as much as by walls. Marriages, kinship, cooperation, exchange, conflict, memory, and obligation all decide whether a settlement continues to feel central. If ties to other groups became stronger, if younger people found spouses, work, food, or safety elsewhere, the old place might slowly lose its future without being hated or violently rejected. Paths outward could become more important than paths inward. A settlement can be left not because people forget it, but because life begins to gather around another center. Near the origin of settled life, all these pressures would have touched an older human ability: adaptation. People were not helpless before change. They could alter diet, movement, labor, storage, alliances, and seasonal patterns. That is why none of these possibilities should be treated as a single answer. The abandoned settlement may have faced environmental stress, food pressure, biological strain, population change, and social reorganization together. Each one could make the others heavier. Less water could make cleaning harder. Less food could make illness more serious. More illness could make labor weaker. Weaker labor could slow repair. Slower repair could make departure more reasonable. The mystery is not that one cause hides from us. It is that many causes may have braided together until staying no longer seemed like the safest way to continue. No single possibility should be treated as the final answer too early. That is the discipline the ruins ask from us. A dry landscape may suggest climate pressure, but climate alone may not explain the whole human story. Storage pits and food remains may suggest changes in diet or supply, but food alone may not explain why every household changed its relationship to the place. Close living may suggest health pressure, smoke, waste, insects, or contact with animals, but disease alone should not be made into a certainty without clear evidence. A growing population may suggest strain, but more people can also mean more labor, more memory, more care, and more skill. Social ties may have pulled people outward, but movement does not mean disappearance. Each possible explanation is a piece of a larger pattern, and the most honest picture may be the one that refuses to make any single piece carry the whole weight. This is difficult because the mind wants a conclusion. It wants the buried settlement to say, "This is why I ended." But the ground rarely speaks that directly. It gives fragments of use, change, pressure, and absence. It may show that rooms were used differently. It may show that repair slowed. It may show changes in plants, animals, tools, refuse, or fire. It may show that people stayed for a long time, then did not stay in the same way. What it may not show is the exact balance of reasons that made leaving more sensible than rebuilding. Near the beginning of settled life, that balance would have been delicate. People were not only living inside houses, they were living inside a new relationship with time. To build was to trust tomorrow. To store was to trust a later season. To bury, repair, and return was to let one place hold more meaning than a temporary camp. But every act of trust depends on conditions beyond itself. Walls cannot create rain. Hearths cannot create fuel. Storage cannot create endless food. Memory cannot make a strained landscape generous again. Cooperation can carry people far, but even cooperation has limits when the body is hungry, thirsty, sick, exhausted, or pulled toward a better chance elsewhere. The abandonment of a settlement may therefore be less like one answer and more like a threshold. On one side of the threshold, staying still makes sense. The work is hard, but the place gives back enough. The water can still be reached. Food can still be gathered, grown, hunted, managed, stored, or exchanged. Rooms can still be repaired. Children can still learn the old paths as the center of life. On the other side, the same actions begin to feel less certain. Repair becomes delayed. Storage becomes thinner. Paths outward become more useful. Younger people may imagine their lives elsewhere. The settlement remains, but its future has moved. No one has to name the threshold for it to be crossed. It may be crossed slowly by many ordinary choices that never look historic while they are happening. This is why the mystery should remain open until the end. Not because nothing can be known, but because the most truthful knowledge is incomplete. The ancient place beneath dry earth may not be a puzzle with one missing key. It may be a record of many pressures meeting inside one human community. The walls show that people once trusted the ground enough to stay. The silence shows that trust did not last forever. Between those two facts lies the careful truth. Abandonment was probably not only a disaster, not only a choice, not only nature, not only society, but a changing balance between all of them. The hardest thing about a settlement before writing is that it has no surviving voice of its own. Later ruins may speak through names, lists, seals, tablets, carved words, prayers, laws, accounts, or warnings left by people who expected someone else to read them. A much older settlement does not give us that kind of human explanation. It leaves behind walls, surfaces, fire marks, bones, seeds, tools, and traces of repeated use. But it does not leave a sentence saying who first came there, what they called the place, what they feared, what they hoped, or why the final household stopped renewing it. This absence is not just a missing detail. It changes the entire way we must listen to the past. We cannot enter it through testimony. We enter through matter. A floor becomes a record because people crossed it. A hearth becomes a record because fire returned to it. A wall becomes a record because hands built it, repaired it, and accepted its place in daily life. Yet these records do not speak like human memory. They show action without explanation. They preserve contact without intention. They reveal that life happened, while leaving the meaning of that life partly beyond reach. This is why the buried settlement feels so lonely in the long history of human beings. It belongs to a time when people were already capable of deep cooperation, planning, craft, care, and continuity. But before they could leave us written histories of themselves, their lives were not primitive in the sense of being empty or simple. They were complex in ways that were carried through practice rather than text. A child learned by watching hands, not reading instructions. A builder knew the wall through touch, weight, moisture, and repair. A cook knew the hearth through heat, smoke, smell, and timing. A gatherer or herder knew the land through repeated seasons. A community knew itself through shared labor, kinship, memory, and return. None of this needed writing to be real. But without writing, the bridge to us becomes narrow. We see the remains of what people did, not the full reasons they gave to one another. Near the beginning of settled life, this gap is especially important. People were taking one of the most important steps in the human story, allowing a place to hold more of life than a temporary camp could hold. They were building continuity into the ground. They were letting rooms, hearths, storage spaces, and perhaps burial places gather meaning across generations. But the very people who made this transformation did not leave behind written explanations of what it felt like to live through it. We must therefore resist the urge to make them speak in our words. We should not invent their thoughts. We should not claim to know the private meaning of a room, a burial, a meal, or a departure. The honest path is slower. We can say that they built. We can say that they returned. We can say that they organized space. We can say that their settlement depended on water, food, labor, health, and social cooperation. We can say that, eventually, the place was no longer used in the same way. But between these statements lies a silence that cannot be filled carelessly. That silence is not empty, it is the space where humility belongs. The ancient settlement beneath dry earth reminds us that human history did not begin with written certainty. It began with bodies making marks in the world. It began with hands shaping shelter, fire changing soil, food leaving traces, and people trusting a place long enough for memory to settle into layers. The tragedy, or perhaps the lesson, is that the first people who helped create this new way of living could not tell us directly why it ended there. The people who lived in the ancient settlement should not be treated as shadows moving through a mystery. They were human bodies in a real place, under real conditions, doing the repeated work that keeps life possible. They woke into heat, cold, hunger, thirst, smoke, noise, dust, and the needs of others. They carried water because the body cannot wait for ideas. They prepared food because memory alone cannot feed a child. They repaired walls because shelter fails if hands do not return to it. They gathered fuel because every fire asks the landscape to give something back. They shaped tools, cleaned spaces, watched children, cared for the weak, buried the dead, and learned the limits of the ground beneath them. This is where the settlement becomes more than an archaeological puzzle. It becomes a former human habitat. The walls were not built for our curiosity. They were built because wind, sun, darkness, animals, insects, and temperature pressed against living skin. The hearths were not symbols first. They were heat, cooking, light, smoke, and work. Storage spaces were not only evidence of planning, they were answers to hunger before hunger arrived. A floor was not only a surface. It was where bodies bent, rested, crossed, worked, and aged. In this way, the buried place brings us close to the oldest continuity in the human story, the body trying to remain alive in a changing world. Before written history, before names, before the city in its later form, people still had backs that tired, hands that cracked, lungs that breathed smoke, eyes that watched the weather, and stomachs that depended on the next meal. They were not abstract ancestors, they were living organisms inside a social world. Their choices were shaped by the same basic pressures that had shaped humanity for a very long time: water, food, care, danger, fatigue, cooperation, memory, and the need to raise the next generation. Settled life did not remove these pressures. It gathered them into one place. A child in such a community may have learned the settlement through repetition, where fire was safe, where food was kept, where adults worked, where refuse belonged, where certain rooms were entered, where certain paths led outward. An older person may have carried knowledge of past seasons, past repairs, past shortages, and past routes beyond the settlement. A sick person may have depended on others more than the ground can show. A pregnant person, an injured worker, a tired child, or someone grieving a death would have experienced the place not as a ruin, but as the immediate world of the body. We cannot know their private thoughts, and we should not pretend to, but we can understand that daily life was never separate from biology. The success of the settlement depended on whether bodies could keep doing what the place required. If water had to be carried farther, the body knew it before the wall did. If food became harder to process, the hands and shoulders knew it before the storage pit did. If smoke filled rooms more often, the lungs knew it before the hearth became an archaeological stain. If social cooperation weakened, the sick, the young, and the old would feel it first. This is why abandonment cannot be understood only by looking at buildings. The buildings survived because they were made of material. The bodies did not survive in the same complete way, yet they were the true measure of whether the settlement could continue. A place remains alive only while people can keep paying its daily cost. When that cost grows too heavy, the body may begin to answer before the mind has a story for it. It walks farther, rests less, eats differently, returns later, repairs less, and eventually follows life somewhere else. Before written history, people were already making places that could hold memory. They did not need alphabets, kings, walls of defense, or official records to begin changing the human relationship with land. A shelter used once is a response to weather. A shelter rebuilt many times becomes something else. It becomes a point of return. A hearth lit again and again becomes more than fire. It becomes a pattern around which hunger, warmth, light, and human closeness are arranged. A floor renewed over older floors becomes a quiet sign that people were no longer moving only through the world, but allowing one part of the world to gather their lives into layers. This was one of the deep beginnings of settled humanity. It did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not replace movement completely, but in certain landscapes, under certain conditions, human beings began to place more of their future in the same ground. That choice shaped everything that followed. It changed how food was stored, how children learned, how old people remembered, how the dead remained near the living, how work was divided, and how a community imagined tomorrow. Yet the same beginning also carried the possibility of leaving. To settle is to trust a place. But trust is not permanent by itself. It must be renewed through water, food, shelter, health, labor, cooperation, and time. If those things remain within reach, a settlement can deepen. If they begin to drift apart, the same place can slowly lose its hold. This is why an abandoned settlement from deep prehistory is so powerful. It shows both sides of the human beginning. It shows the wish to remain and the need to move. It shows walls shaped by patience and silence shaped by departure. It shows that long before written history, people were already living with a question that has never left us. How much of life should be placed in one place, and when must life continue somewhere else? We should not imagine the people there as less human because their names are gone. They knew the world through touch, memory, hunger, weather, kinship, and repetition. Their knowledge may have been carried in stories spoken near fires, in the trained eye of someone reading the land, in the hand that knew how wet clay should feel, in the body that knew how far water could be carried before the journey became too much. None of that knowledge was small. It was the foundation from which later villages, towns, and cities would grow, but it was not written for us. When the settlement was finally left, the explanation did not remain fixed beside the walls. It may have moved with the people. It may have faded across generations. It may have been divided among many causes too ordinary to survive as one clear story. The dry earth kept what it could, the shape of rooms, traces of fire, fragments of tools, signs of repeated life. It could not keep the full meaning of the final departure. That is the deepest lesson of the place beneath the desert. Human history began not as a clean record, but as an unfinished conversation between bodies and landscapes. People made homes before they could write their histories. They built continuity before they could explain it to distant descendants. They learned to remain, but they never stopped belonging to a species shaped by change. The ancient settlement was not only a ruin waiting to be discovered, it was once a living answer to the question of where human life could continue. Then, one day, or over many seasons, that answer changed. The abandoned settlement beneath the desert is more than a mystery of old walls. It is a reminder that every human world is held together by conditions that can change. A place may look solid because it has rooms, floors, hearths, storage spaces, and paths worn by repeated use. But beneath those visible things lies something more fragile, the balance between land and body, between memory and need, between the effort of staying and the possibility of moving on. The people who lived there did not build in emptiness. They built because, for a time, the surrounding world gave enough water, enough food, enough material, enough cooperation, and enough hope for return to make sense. The settlement was a living agreement between people and place. As long as that agreement held, walls could be repaired, fires could be lit, children could learn the same paths, and memory could settle into the ground. When the agreement weakened, the same walls could remain while the reason to maintain them slowly disappeared. This is the quiet lesson that runs through the whole story. Human places are not kept alive by architecture alone. They are kept alive by daily renewal. A wall must be repaired, a hearth must be fed, a storage pit must be filled, water must be carried, food must be prepared, waste must be managed, the young must be cared for, the sick must be supported, the dead must be remembered. The living must still believe that the labour of tomorrow belongs here. If enough of these acts continue, a settlement remains more than a structure, it remains a world. If they weaken, the place begins to change even before it becomes empty. This is why the silence of the ancient site feels so deep. It is not simply the silence of ruined buildings, it is the silence left after thousands of small acts stopped repeating. Near the beginning of settled human life, that silence carries special weight. People were learning one of the most important experiments in our species' history, how to make one place hold the future. The older human past had taught movement, attention, and adaptation across changing landscapes. The newer settled life taught return, storage, repair, closeness, and continuity. Neither way was simple. Movement carried danger. Staying carried burden. A settlement could protect bodies from some old hardships, while creating new ones through crowding, waste, smoke, dependence, and pressure on nearby resources. It could give people memory in the ground, but it could also tie them to conditions beyond their control. The abandoned place shows that the first steps towards settled life were not a straight road into security. They were an experiment in balance. This does not make the people who left seem weaker, it makes them more understandable. They were not failing a future we now imagine for them. They were living inside their own conditions, with their own knowledge, their own limits, and their own ways of adapting. If the settlement no longer held life well enough, leaving may have been the wiser choice. The walls remained because walls cannot walk. The living could still carry tools, memories, skills, food practices, relationships, and ways of building into another landscape. What looks to us like an ending may also have been a continuation beyond the edge of the ruin. That is the educational value of this ancient silence. Civilization does not begin only with monuments, kings, or writing. It begins with water close enough to reach, food reliable enough to share, bodies strong enough to work, trust strong enough to cooperate, and memory strong enough to return. And when those foundations shift, even the most carefully made place can become a question left in the earth. The oldest foundations of civilization were not made from stone first. They were made from needs that had to be answered again and again. Water had to be close enough for human bodies to reach. Food had to be gathered, grown, hunted, managed, stored, or shared often enough for children to wake the next morning. Fire had to be fed. Shelter had to be repaired. Tools had to be made and remade. Trust had to exist between people who depended on one another in ways too ordinary to become monuments. Before palaces, there were hands carrying water. Before kings, there were people deciding how food would be divided. Before writing, there were memories held in older bodies and taught through repeated work. Before a city could become a symbol, it had to become a place where the body could survive. This is what an ancient settlement beneath dry earth teaches more clearly than any dramatic legend. Civilization did not begin as greatness, it began as maintenance. It began with the daily decision to return to the same ground and make life possible there one more time. A wall is impressive only because someone had enough reason to build it. A storage space matters only because hunger was expected to come again. A hearth matters only because cold, darkness, and food preparation were part of the human condition. A path matters only because feet crossed it often enough to make one direction familiar. These simple things are not small. They are the roots from which larger human worlds grew. Later civilizations would build temples, roads, laws, armies, markets, and written archives. But beneath all of that remained the same older question. Can this place support life long enough for people to trust it? If the answer was yes, people could deepen their attachment. They could repair, remember, teach, bury, store, and begin again. If the answer became uncertain, the whole structure of life became uncertain with it. This is why the abandoned settlement should not be understood only as a puzzle about the past. It is also a lesson about dependence. Human beings often imagine civilization as something separate from nature, as if walls remove us from the landscape, but the first settled communities show the opposite. The more people stayed in one place, the more deeply they depended on the land around them. Water, plants, animals, soil, fuel, weather, and distance entered the settlement every day through work. The outside world did not end at the wall. It crossed the wall in every meal, every breath of smoke, every jar of stored food, every bundle of fuel, every carried container of water. A settlement was never only a human invention. It was a relationship between human effort and the living conditions around it. When that relationship held, the place could feel stable. When it weakened, stability could become memory. The people who left were not necessarily walking away from civilization. They may have been protecting its deeper elements: cooperation, knowledge, care, and adaptation. Those things could move even when walls could not. This may be the calmest and most useful message of the ruin. What makes human life endure is not the building itself, but the ability to notice when a way of living no longer fits the world that must support it. The ancient settlement remains, because earth can hold shapes. The people are gone because life must follow possibility. Somewhere between the walls that stayed and the humans who moved, we can see the beginning of a truth that still belongs to us. Every civilization rests on quiet foundations, and the most important ones are often the easiest to forget. In the end, the most truthful answer may be the one that refuses to become too certain. The ancient settlement beneath the desert does not give us a final sentence. It gives us walls, floors, hearths, fragments of food, traces of tools, and the silence of a place once filled with repeated life. It tells us that human beings stayed there long enough for the ground to remember them. It tells us that they built, cooked, stored, repaired, gathered, carried, learned, and returned. It tells us that a community once trusted that place with part of its future, but it does not tell us, in one clear voice, why that trust ended. That is not a weakness in the story. It is the honest shape of deep history. Before writing, before official records, before anyone could leave behind a final explanation, human lives were recorded in matter and then partly erased by time. The desert preserved enough to make the place visible, but not enough to make its ending simple. Perhaps the water became harder to reach. Perhaps food became less reliable. Perhaps the land changed slowly around the settlement. Perhaps the pressure of living close together grew heavier. Perhaps sickness, smoke, waste, labor, population, fuel, and social ties all added weight in ways no single layer of soil can fully explain. Perhaps another place became more useful, not suddenly, but gradually, until the old settlement stopped being the center of tomorrow. Each possibility is reasonable only if it remains a possibility. None should be forced into the whole truth. The deeper lesson is that human worlds do not survive because they are impressive. They survive because the quiet conditions beneath them keep working. Water must answer. Food must answer. Bodies must keep working. Children must be cared for. The old must be supported. The sick must be helped. Walls must be renewed. Trust must be repaired as surely as mudbrick. The land around a settlement must continue to give enough, and the people inside it must continue to believe that staying is worth the cost. When that balance holds, even a modest place can become a world. When it weakens, even a beloved place can become too heavy to carry. The people who left were not necessarily defeated. They may have been adapting, as humans had adapted for countless generations before them. They may have left walls behind while carrying skills, memories, tools, seeds, relationships, and ways of living into another landscape. The rooms went silent, but human life may have continued beyond them. This is why the abandoned settlement should not be treated only as a lost city or a strange discovery. It is also a mirror held up from the beginning of settled life. It shows us that civilization begins in ordinary needs, and that every place humans build rests on a living agreement with the world around it. We build as if our homes, towns, and cities are permanent, but every wall still depends on water, food, labor, care, memory, and time. The ancient desert settlement reminds us to look at human history with humility. Some mysteries are not waiting for one dramatic answer. Some are preserved to teach us the limits of certainty. A place can be known through its traces and still remain partly unknowable in its final reason. The walls can tell us that people stayed. The silence can tell us that staying ended. Between those two truths, the desert leaves its last open question. When humans finally walk away from a place they once trusted, what are they truly leaving behind?